So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Recently as I write this, less so as you're watching it, especially if you're not watching in early access, Answers in Genesis had a convention called Beyond Bones, The Truth About Dinosaurs. You may or may not know, but I consider that to be my turf. Now, some of the talks at this convention aren't terribly interesting to me, like the one about dragon legends being about late surviving non-avian dinosaurs, backed up by ancient and medieval art that doesn't actually look like dinosaurs. I've covered that ad nauseum, and as a result, the idea of doing it again makes me feel nauseated. So I won't. But I will do a series about Joel Lineweber's talk about whether or not birds are dinosaurs, because apparently I have infinite patience for that nonsense. Now I'm just going to assume that I don't know how to correctly pronounce Lineweber, as Joel pronounces it, so I'm going to call him Joel. I think in Germany it's roughly Lineweber, but I also suck at German, so yeah, Joel it is. One last note is that for now, when I say bird, I mean member of the taxonomic group Aves, which includes all living birds, their most recent common ancestor, and any of its descendants. Anyway, let's see what he's got for us.
Around 2 years ago, I was sitting on my couch, my wife was out of town, and I had just put the kids to bed.
Oh good, a pointless anecdote.
And there was a thud on the window of our back door.
Joel sprang from his bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window he flew like a flash, tore open the shutters, and threw up a sash. On the moon the breast of the new-fallen snow gave a luster of midday to objects below, when what to his wondering eyes did appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so lively and quick, he knew in a moment it must be St. Nick.
And I didn't really notice it, but my dogs did. We got 2 little dogs, and they ran over, and I looked outside, and there was a bird, a dove, who had flown into the window and killed itself. And so poor little dove was right there. So I did what any normal human being would do. I grabbed a plastic bag and scooped it up, and then I put together a makeshift dissection kit and put it on the table and started dissecting this dove.
I see that Joel's standard for normal is basically Jeffrey Dahmer. That's nice. In case you're wondering, you probably do not have what is needed to safely conduct a dissection of a wild animal in your house. You need trays, disinfectants, PPE, dissection pins, scalpels, etc. Using what chemicals and tools you have at home is not enough to prevent the spread of disease or injury. Please do not dissect the bodies of wild animals in your home unless you actually have the equipment and chemicals needed, which again, you probably don't have. Many animals can spread pathogens or parasites to humans even after they are dead. This isn't a laughing matter. It could be a matter of life and death, especially if you live with an already ill, immunocompromised, very young, or very old person.
That's not normal? Okay.
It's normal if you plan to progress to eating people, but otherwise, no, it's not, nor is it safe.
So then I called my wife, and I said, "You're not going to believe what I'm doing." And I said, I'm dissecting a bird on our kitchen table. And she's like, there was a pause.
If I were that wife, I wouldn't be pausing, I'd be Googling divorce lawyers.
And I expected her response was not what I expected. I expected her to say something like, "You're doing what?" Instead, she was like, "On my table?"
Yeah, the place where presumably she serves food that she'd rather not have contaminated with whatever nonsense is on a wild dove.
Apparently, she wasn't that surprised that I was dissecting a bird. I don't know.
So he's about to show actual pictures of the whole bird. If that's something you're sensitive to, I'll pause and put a timestamp on the screen for when that's over. If you'd like to avoid seeing this, then just go to that timestamp and you should be okay. If you don't mind, then keep watching. It's not spectacularly gruesome or anything, but it's not exactly a fun thing to look at either, so I won't blame you either way.
So yes, this is the poor little bird that died. Some people would say that I just dissected a dinosaur.
Those people would be correct, and I'm going to guess that at no point in this entire talk will Joel ever give us an adequate definition of a dinosaur, such that it could be used to call all dinosaurs dinosaurs, without lumping in non-dinosaurs such as Postosuchus, Lagosuchus, Scleromoculus, or Rausuchus.
Because they would say that birds are dinosaurs. You hear that these days.
You also hear that the Earth is a globe these days, and for the same reason. It wasn't initially obviously true, but it turns out that we now have an overwhelming amount of data that leads to the inescapable conclusion that the Earth is a globe, and also that birds are dinosaurs. Granted, the second one is a much more recent discovery, but it's still the same basic reason you hear both of those things.
And this idea of feathered dinosaurs is all over the place right now. You see it everywhere.
Including dinosaur fossils.
This is a screenshot from the latest Jurassic World movie with a giant feathered Therizinosaurus.
Yes, that's because in the paper A Therizinosauride Dinosaur with Integumentary Structures from China by Jingzhu et al., published May 27, 1999 in Nature, the dinosaur Bepiosaurus was described, and the holotype included very obvious preserved feather-like integumentary structures, and so because such structures were known from other theropods across Maniraptoriformes, it is reasonable to reconstruct Therizinosaurus with such structures. And in fact, it's no longer reasonable to reconstruct it without them. Think about it like this. This is a gray wolf. This is a brown bear. This is a tiger. You'll notice that all of them have fur. The fur isn't the same, but they still all have it. Now here's the skeleton of Amphision. We know it's definitely more like the bear and the wolf than it is like the tiger, and they both have fur. And if they both have fur, and the more distant tiger also has fur, what are the chances that Amphision had fur? Well, basically 100%. Anyone who reconstructed a naked Amphision would need to do some serious explaining if they wanted their reconstruction to be taken as a reasonable one. Similarly, we have these filaments in animals like Bepiosaurus, Eutyrannus, and Sinosauropteryx. The default, then, is that animals like Therizinosaurus were indeed covered in hair-like strands that are often called protofeathers.
Or this dinosaur, Pyroraptor.
Well, the thing about Pyroraptor is that its remains are so fragmentary that I can't really say anything about it. Jurassic World Dominion reconstructed them as Dromaeosaurs, the family to which Velociraptor belongs, but it's not actually clear if that's what they were. Nonetheless, we know from examples like Microraptor that Dromaeosaurs were fully feathered, including with modern-looking remiges. And we also know that these remiges were deeply rooted to the bone, like modern bird remiges, because of the presence of ulnar quill knobs on Velociraptor. You see, the deeply rooted feathers on the trailing edge of the wings actually leave behind scars on the bone they attach to in the form of small bumps. These bumps are seen on both modern birds and Mesozoic dinosaurs, even in some very basal ones like Concavenator. So, if we're going to assume that Pyroraptor was a dromaeosaur, which is plausible, then yes, it had plumage. In fact, more than Jurassic World Dominion gives it.
You can do a Google image search for feathered dinosaurs, and it'll come back with thousands of images.
I mean, that's true, but you can do a Google image search for just about anything and it'll turn up pictures. That's true for things that are real and for things that aren't. I typed Bill Clinton and found thousands of images that came up. I typed mermaid and thousands of images came up. That doesn't mean that Bill Clinton is fake or that mermaids are real, just that there are a lot of pictures of them. Other than the fact that feathered dinosaurs are a meme, I don't know what point Joel is trying to make.
Now you can even ask AI to generate a feathered dinosaur for you, and it'll happily comply.
Well, yeah, generative AI is designed to give you pictures of whatever you ask it to. You could get it to give you feathered elephants if you want.
This was a toy that someone I know found in a church's Sunday school classroom.
A cute little oviraptor, a group of dinosaurs we now know were feathered because of their preserved brooding behavior in which they drape their arms over the eggs in such a way that they couldn't have been insulated by the parent unless the parent had feathers. So our options are that Oviraptor has a hugely maladaptive brooding strategy, or that it had feathers. Since maladaptions don't tend to last long, the feathers is the much more likely option.
Now, I don't blame anybody. I'm sure somebody just picked up a bunch of dinosaur toys and they put it in the classroom, right?
The idea that anyone would think this is blameworthy is on its own weird and creepy to me. It's a reasonably accurate dinosaur for toy babies. It's not driven by some agenda.
But this idea is showing up everywhere, and it's hard. As a Christian, it's important for us to know how do we handle this issue.
The fact that science learning new things is an issue for Joel's theology is a problem for his theology. If your theology requires you to simply reject aspects of objective reality, then your theology is wrong. Joel's theology is wrong, at least to the degree that it requires that he reject parts of reality. To the degree to which it does not do that, then it is only possibly wrong. My recommendation would be that he get a theology that is entirely only possibly wrong, rather than one that is demonstrably wrong in at least some places. If he thinks that negates the whole of the gospel, then I'd recommend he stop being a Christian. Most Christians belong to denominations or ecclesial bodies that do not require that evolution be false for their theology to work, so he could also just join one of those groups.
So it's been a pleasure working with some great scientists and researchers on this here at Answers in Genesis.
If you have to lie about science, you're not a great researcher or scientist. If you have to ignore data, you're not a great researcher or scientist. All of those so-called researchers and scientists at AIG do both.
And the research we've done over the last several years turns over 100 years of evolutionary dogma.
Wow, that's pretty amazing, and I'm sure that this conclusive evidence is about to be published in an actual journal where the claims will be reviewed for accuracy and completeness by people who aren't just other creationists who start with a required conclusion, making them definitionally pseudoscientists, right? No, of course not. This is just a rewording of the old chestnut that evolution is a theory in crisis, a crisis that has been ongoing for like half a century without any evolutionary biologists actually noticing. That they have science that has overturned evolution just waiting to be released is a whopper of the likes that even Elizabeth Holmes or Elon Musk would be embarrassed to make.
And it's just really exciting. Over 100 species of animals. We've reviewed hundreds and hundreds of books and scientific papers on this topic.
What does that even mean? AIG has reviewed organisms? What does that look like? Is it like Tier Zoo but for creationists? The lava cricket is an A-tier insect, but the botfly is F-tier?
So let's see where you guys are on this topic. Because some of you might be thinking, well, dinosaurs and birds, they look so different.
I am not thinking that, because that is a silly thing to think. It's like thinking that mammals and whales look so different. I mean, sure, when asked to draw a generic mammal, I'm certainly not going to draw a whale. But it doesn't matter how unusual within mammalia whales are, they're still mammals. Similarly, no matter how atypical compared to dinosaurs as a whole birds are, that doesn't make them not dinosaurs.
I bet you I can tell the difference. So,
I bet you he can't, and won't even try. Remember, to say that Group X is not part of Group Y, you first have to define Group Y, then Group X, then show why X does or does not meet the criteria to be in Group Y. I'm guessing he won't define either bird or dinosaur in a way that actually lets us identify either.
what do you think? Does this look like a dinosaur or a bird? Shout out your answer.
That's Velociraptor with broken fingers. It's a dinosaur.
Looks like a dinosaur. How about this one?
That's also Velociraptor with a beak we know it didn't have, since you can tell if a skull had a beak in life because the cuticle for the keratin of a beak leaves behind texture on the skull. And also, it is in a position that would cause it to tip backwards because the tail is too long for it to maintain balance with the femora nearly horizontal, as they're positioned in this. Also, the fingers are no longer dislocated, which is nice. It's still a dinosaur. And unless you want to use bird extremely broadly, it's not a bird. It's also certainly not a bird in the traditional Linnaean sense.
That looks like a bird.
The fact that whatever AIG artist made this had to lie about Velociraptor to get people to say that it's a bird should be a red flag to any person actually interested in the truth.
There's just one problem. That's the same skeleton. Both of those drawings are based on the same skeleton.
Was that supposed to be a reveal?
Same bones, just posed differently. One pose makes it look like a dinosaur. The other pose makes it look like a bird.
Both poses make it look like a dinosaur, because whether it's a dinosaur is based on actual features of the bones that don't change because you simply put them in a different pose. It also doesn't help that neither pose is actually biologically possible, since one is unbalanced and the other has dislocated finger bones. Dinosaurs characteristically have a deltopectoral crest on the humerus that takes up 30 to 40% of the humerus. Does this skeleton have that? Yep, right there. So it looks like a dinosaur. Other characteristics of Dinosauria, like the perforate acetabulum or the asymmetrical fork trochanter of the femur, or the arrangement of the astragalus and calcaneus in the ankle, are not visible from this lateral view, so I can't use them to say if it looks like a dinosaur or not.
And the fossil evidence doesn't do much for us, doesn't help us very much with knowing how the animal was posed in life.
Well, it does. First, don't dislocate bones. Second, don't unbalance the animal. Those are good starting points. But also the pose doesn't matter as to what it is. Humans don't become dogs if they go down on all fours, and kangaroos aren't humans because they stand on 2 feet.
It's hard to tell. So, what criteria can we use?
Good question. You can use the actual anatomical definition of a dinosaur. like the aforementioned deltopectoral crest of the humerus and the shape of the fourth trochanter of the femur, but also things like a crocodile reverse ankle joint between the calcaneus and the astragalus in the ankle, 3 or more sacral vertebrae, a strong connection between the transverse processes of those same sacral vertebrae and the sacral arches, a femoral head that's distinctly offset from the shaft and turned medially, allowing the animal to hold its legs parallel to the sagittal plane, reduced or absent 4th and 5th digits on the manus, no claws on digits 4 and 5 of the manus when present, etc. The problem, of course, is that when you do this, birds come out of the wash as dinosaurs, regardless of how you pose their skeletons.
If all we have is the bones in many cases, what criteria can we use? How do we know the difference between a dinosaur and a bird?
By using the anatomical definitions. Of course, you'd also have to show how the anatomical definition of birds precludes it from also meeting the definition for dinosaur, but that's like 3 steps into the process, and we're not even at step 1.
Well, you might have some ideas running through your head, so let's talk about what some of those might be. Here is a skeleton of Archaeopteryx, and you might see some things on this animal, and you might say, well, that doesn't look like a bird.
Yes, specifically teeth, lack of a beak, unfused metatarsals, unfused metacarpals, and carpals in the manus, lack of inverted hallux or big toe, although the skeletal reconstruction on screen falsely shows them inverted, the long maxilla, and the long bony tail all show it's not a bird, since birds diagnostically have fused metatarsals, fused manus, carpals, and metacarpals, no teeth, a short maxilla and long premaxilla, a beak or bill, an inverted hallux, and a short bony tail that ends in a ptegostyle that is itself made of fused caudal vertebrae. So I can say with complete confidence that Archaeopteryx is not a bird, if by bird we mean member of the taxonomic group Aves. If Joel has some idiosyncratic definition of bird, then sure, whatever, maybe it meets that. But if the whole talk is just an argument over where on a taxonomy to stick the common word bird, then he's not really engaging with science or evolution or even worldviews. He's just arguing that he wants some things called birds without that meaning anything for their anatomy or evolutionary history or lack thereof.
Like there's claws? Look at those big claws.
Not something I mentioned. Many birds have claws on their wings, although no extant bird has 3 as far as I'm aware.
Do birds have claws on their wings?
Yes, although no claws is common in Neo-Aves, which are birds that aren't paleognaths, like ostriches and emus, and aren't in Galloanceri, or the fowl, like swans and chickens. Interestingly, the same group that has claws is the same group that has penises, something else most birds lack. Well, they're not technically penises in the mammalian sense, but they're intermittent organs, so good enough for government work.
Actually, go to the grocery store, pick up a chicken wing. On that first digit there, most likely, most of the time, it'll have a little claw.
Many companies actually remove the very tip of the thumb on chicken wings, so you may not find a claw there, but yes, like many birds, chickens have thumb claws.
Well, you say that's not really a claw, it's just kind of a little nub, right?
No, I would not say that. Whether it's a claw is a matter of the anatomy, not the size of the structure. It's a keratin sheath over an ungule digit, so it's a claw.
Well, how about this picture? This is an ostrich. Look at the size of those claws. We just don't see them very much because they're usually covered with feathers. Turns out, almost half of the families of birds have members with wing claws. Claws on the wings are just part of God's design for birds. Surprising.
Maybe it's surprising to people who have never looked into avian anatomy and diversity, but it's not surprising to me. Also, the graphic does not actually have each bird belonging to a different family, which is odd. In fact, the family Anatidae has at least 3 different birds pictured: a wood duck, egg sponsa, a mallard, Anis platyrhynchus, and a mute swan, Cygnus olor. The last one seems to be from a population introduced from Eurasia to North America, since the picture is by Janet Griffin Scott, who, based on her portfolio on alamy.com, is a wildlife photographer from North America who focuses on birds, primarily waterfowl and birds of prey.
Well, you might say, well, what about fingers, right? Like that Archaeopteryx, it looks like it has 3 fingers. Dinosaurs have fingers, but birds don't really have fingers, do they?
Yes, birds have fingers. In fact, they have the same 3 fingers as tetanurine theropods. That is, the group that gave rise to birds. The difference is that birds have those fingers fused into a carpometacarpus. Archaeopteryx doesn't.
So again, look at this ostrich photo. You can't see fingers. There's no skin wrapped around separate fingers, really. But if you look at the skeleton, you can see, oh, there's 3 digits there.
See, now this is starting to really annoy me, because this is showing 3 unfused metacarpals and proximal phalanges that are also not unfused. But that's how an embryonic bird wing is arranged. This is an actual photograph of actual ostrich wing bones. You'll note the extensive fusion that his illustration neglected. The only reason that I could see why someone would do this is to try to trick people into thinking that the hands of Archaeopteryx and Struthio, that is the genus to which the ostrich belongs, are more similar than they are, in an attempt to downplay the transitional nature of Archaeopteryx.
Now, they're fused a little bit.
More than a bit, and that fusion isn't in the on-screen illustration.
And that's something we find in modern adult birds. If you look at that chicken wing on the right there, you can see that blue bone. It's actually 4 bones all fused together in an adult bird. So most adult birds fuse together like this. Those 4 bones into something called the carpometacarpus.
No, not most birds. All birds. That's a diagnostic feature of birds. No carpometacarpus? Not a bird. In the sense of a member of Aves. If you want to speak about birds in the broad sense, then sure. But then again, we're just talking semantics. If all Joel wants to do is broaden the range of animals that people call birds, that does nothing to argue for or against their evolution within Dinosauria.
It's really fancy science speak for the carpal and the metacarpals fused together.
That's true.
But in juvenile birds, they're separate. Those bones are separate.
Right, and even in our oldest, most mature Archaeopteryx, the Solnhofen specimen, which is an adult, the fingers are separate, meaning that according to what Joel just said, it doesn't count as a bird. But you know who's really good at figuring out what is and isn't a bird under multiple definitions? My patrons and channel members. So why not check out my Patreon, where you can, for as little as $1 a month, gain access to scripted videos like this months early, as well as my super secret Discord server just for supporters. You can also get a 15% discount by pledging annually. Alternatively, you can get a channel membership starting at $1.99 a month and gain access to the same videos and Discord server, but also get a cool green name in my live chats and access to channel emojis and a monthly milestone chat at no additional charge.
And when we look at the fossils, you can see we find them in various stages of fusion. Some of them are fused, some of them are less fused. It seems like
an evolutionary sequence. Thanks for doing my job for me, Joel. It's hard for me to imagine a better graphic illustrating the differences in hand morphology going from the very basal Archaeopteryx all the way to extant modern birds. Although, honestly, I'd swap Cathiornis and Sapiornis. Although I do notice that now we're labeling Microraptor as a dromaeosaurid, which is the family to which Velociraptor belongs. So I guess Joel is doubling down on David Menton's claim that Velociraptors are birds? Which is odd, since as far as I know, the Creation Museum still has a scaly, unfeathered raptor hanging out in their Garden of Eden display. Oh well.
In some of these pre-flood animals, they were less likely to be fused for some reason.
The reason isn't a mystery. It's that the fusing of the carpals and metacarpals is a derived trait of Ornithoraces, the group that includes modern birds and their Mesozoic cousins, the enantiornithine birds. Archaeopteryx and all other animals from his list of so-called birds are not members of Ornithoraces, and so have not evolved the carpometacarpus.
But that doesn't mean they're not birds, so you can't use the fingers to tell whether they're a bird or not.
Actually, it does mean that, because the presence of a carpometacarpus is traditionally diagnostic for identifying an animal as a member of Aves. And even though we know it to be an apomorphy of a slightly wider group, Ornithoraces, you have to have the apomorphies of the wider group to be placed in a smaller subgroup, meaning that having a carpometacarpus doesn't mean one definitely is an Aves, but lacking one means one is definitely not an Aves, and therefore not a bird in the traditional sense.
What about the teeth? Archaeopteryx had teeth.
Lack of teeth is diagnostic for the group Euornithes, which is the smallest group that contains Aves and anything else. Basically, it's actual birds in the traditional sense, plus the single genus Archaeorhynchus, meaning that just like having a carpometacarpus is a necessary condition for being an Aves, but is not sufficient, having teeth is a disqualifier for being an Aves, meaning that once again, Archaeopteryx is not a bird in that sense. It is transitional.
Well, modern birds, we don't find teeth. We do find, on some birds, a serrated beak, but that's a different structure.
Joel should tell Kent Hovind. He still pretends that it's actually teeth.
But if we look at fossil birds, there were numerous fossil birds found that did have teeth. There's 6 examples there of different species of fossil birds. Clearly birds. Evolutionists even agree that these animals are birds, but they had teeth.
So what does it mean that so-called evolutionists call these birds? Well, mostly nothing. Remember, bird isn't a scientific term. That's why I have been clear about using it to mean member of the taxon Aves. But scientists aren't beholden to that rule, so why am I bothering with it in this response to an Answers in Genesis talk? Well, because they said that. In the poorly edited blog post, The Debate Over Classification of Archaeopteryx as a Bird, by AIG employee and paleontology PhD Gabriella Haynes, published on September 14, 2022, we can read in the abstract, quote, "Many controversies remain regarding the feather taxonomic classification, flight capabilities, its evolution, and whether Archaeopteryx is a transitional form, a reptile with feathers, or a bird. This paper's scope is to briefly discuss the latter controversy because it has kept creation and secular scientists' view divided. The history of Archaeopteryx findings, their historical interpretations, the role of Linnaean and cladistic classification methods, and the implications of all that on Archaeopteryx classification were analyzed. End quote. So AIG's pet paleontologist is concerned with the Linnaean classification of bird, which if you go read that book, you'll find is Aves.
But wait! There's more!
The abstract ends with, quote, based on a biblical worldview, logical grounds, the anatomy of the skeleton and skull, the presence of feathers, and following the traditional Linnaean classification, no reason remains for Archaeopteryx to be classified as anything other than a bird. So clearly Dr. Haynes thinks that the traditional Linnaean classification of birds is important and should be used to guide the discussion on birds. And remember, Hayes is the in-house Answers in Genesis paleontologist publishing in their in-house blog that pretends to be a journal, even though it demonstrably is not. In the section Archaeopteryx, a dinosaur with feathers, we get this wonderful quote. Quote, the presence of feathers has been key to classifying an animal as a bird based on the classical, conventional, and traditional taxonomy developed by Linnaeus in the 18th century. Gauthier and de Queres, 2001. However, various workers have changed and adapted the classification system before and after Darwin, Amorim, 2002. The Linnaean classification was based on similarities in creatures, but in contrast, Darwin's classification is based on their supposed ancestry. Amorim, 2002. One can see that the data never changed because the animals and their features have been the same. Instead, the lenses used to interpret them changed. End quote. So we shouldn't be messing with what Linnaeus wrote. Apparently, that dude was inspired or something. Later on in the section, cladistics uses different and ambiguous terms and definitions. We find this. Quote, so for definition purposes, it is essential to highlight that the word bird used here is defined in the classical, traditional Linnaean way. End quote. Seems like a pretty strong position is emerging from the woman who, I'll remind you, is the AIG paleontologist writing in their official research blog. So according to Answers in Genesis, in the closest thing we have to an official statement by one of their alleged experts, we shouldn't mess with Linnaeus. So what did he have to say about birds? Well, let's check his book, Systema Naturae. The 10th edition is where we first find his inclusion of birds. What are the characteristics that, according to Linnaeus, who, let's remember, is the guy to ask about birds according to AIG's paleontologist, are as follows. Heart, 2 auricles, 2 ventricles, warm, dark red blood. Lungs, respires alternately. Jaw, incumbent, naked, extended, without teeth. Eggs, covered in a calcareous shell. Organs of sense, tongue, nostrils, eyes, and ears without auricles. Covering, incumbent imbricate feathers. Supports, 2 feet, 2 wings, and a heart-shaped rump. Flies in the air and stings. Later in the 12th edition, we have a much longer discussion. Quote, this beautiful and cheerful portion of created nature consists of animals having a body covered with feathers and down, jaws protracted and naked, wings 2 formed for flight, and 2 feet. They are aerial, vocal, swift, and light, and destitute of external ears, lips, teeth, scrotum, womb, bladder, epiglottis, corpus callosum and its arch, and diaphragm. The feathers are disposed over each other in the form of quincunx intermixed with down, distinct from the quill and tails, feathers, convex above, concave beneath, narrower on the outer side, lax at the fore end, hollow and horny at the base, with a central pith and furnished on each side with elongated shaft with parallel, approximate, distinct, flat laminae, composing the vein. They vary in color according to age, sex, season, or climate, except the quill and tail feathers, which are more constant and chiefly characterize the species. The eggs are various in number, size, and color, but always covered with a calcareous shell, deposited in an artificial nest and hatched by the genial warmth of the parent. The body is oval, terminated by a heart-shaped rump, and furnished all over with aerial receptacles communicating with the lungs or throat necessary for flight or song, and which may be filled or emptied at pleasure. The rump has 2 glands, secreting an unctuous fluid which is pressed out by the bill to anoint the discomposed parts of the feathers. Bill horny, extending from the head, either hooked at the end for tearing prey, or slender for searching in the mire, or flat and broad for gobbling, and it is used for building nests, feeding the young, climbing, or as an instrument of offense and defense. Furnished with orbits and a nictitant membrane, ears truncate without auricles, wings compressed, consisting of movable joints and covered with quills and feathers. Legs placed usually near the center of gravity with toes and claws of various shapes. Tail serving as the rudder or director of the body. They are mostly monogamous or live in single pairs and migrate into milder climates upon defect of food or warmth, and a few become torpid in winter. The generic characteristics taken from the bill, tongue, nostrils, cirri, carnacles, and other naked parts. End quote. So do any of these animals count as birds according to the definition that Dr. Hayes of Answers in Genesis insists we must use? No, they do not. Nothing with teeth is a bird. Nothing without a beak is a bird. Not according to me, according to Gabriella Haynes, even though she then went on to argue that Archaeopteryx is a bird, which is a bit confusing. So anytime that Answers in Genesis wants to say that something that's not an aves, which was originally defined by Linnaeus, is a bird, I get to call foul. See what I did there? That's why I'm sticking with aves as what I mean by bird, at least in this series.
Teeth and beaks.
Sinornis didn't have a beak, but whatever.
So at this point, you might be ready to throw your wings up in the air and say, maybe birds are dinosaurs.
Yeah, they are, and I'd like to point out that we're still not at step 1 with Joel here. Remember, the first steps are to define the categories in question, bird and dinosaur. He hasn't done either. He's just jumping into pictures of skeletons and declaring that things are birds without any reason provided.
Dinosaurs and birds are very different.
Okay, let's get some definitions. That would be nice.
And we're going to talk about 7 major differences between dinosaurs and birds today.
Well, that doesn't bode well. Look, I could give a talk in which I give you 7 major differences between whales and mammals. Watch, let's do it. 1. Whales have only 2 limbs. Mammals have 4. 2. Whales have a tail fluke. Mammals don't. 3. Whale pelvises don't connect to the spine, but mammal pelvises do. 4. Whales have flippers, not feet or hands like mammals. 5. Whales have blubber. Mammals don't. 6. Whales are born tail first. Mammals are born head first. 7. Whales are water animals, but mammals live on the land at least sometimes. Well, I have now shown that whales aren't mammals in the style of Answers in Genesis, showing us that birds aren't dinosaurs. Of course, you might notice a problem. You probably learned in school that mammals are animals with fur or hair that nurse their young on milk and give live birth. While that's not quite the technical definition, that definition does include only mammals, and whales meet the definition. It turns out they also meet the more technical and detailed definition too. So what I've really done is point out ways in which whales are unique among mammals, not ways to tell that they are not mammals. In order to do that, I'd have to pick something about whales, for instance hair, and argue that whales don't have hair. Of course, whales do have hair, as you can see in this picture, but at least then I'm trying to actually find something that makes a mammal and point out that whales don't have it. Or I could try to argue that whales don't actually produce milk. Of course, this picture of a nursing calf might belie that, but still, if it were true, it would be great evidence against whales being mammals. But note that I can only do that after establishing that hair and milk are vital to an animal being a mammal. So let's see why birds are unique among dinosaurs in a way that doesn't in any way make them not dinosaurs.
Now, some of you might have noticed something else about Archaeopteryx. The bony tail. Raise your hand if you noticed the bony tail. Anybody see that?
I did, but my arms don't really go above my head, so excuse me for not raising a hand.
Extra credit points to you guys. Good job. Bony tail. The tail turns out is very important, and we're going to talk about that later.
Thanks for being a tease, Joel.
But first, I want to quickly touch on this question. Couldn't God have created dinosaurs with feathers?
Assuming the existence of a creator god with the attributes usually assigned to him by people who think like Joel, yes, he's omnipotent, so he can do whatever he wants.
Could he have done that? Yes, absolutely. We're not going to limit God and say he couldn't have done something. But the joy of science is finding out what God did do.
Well, he made these dinosaurs with feathers, if he made them at all.
So it's not a question of whether he could or not. He could have. But let's look at the evidence. And we want to start with what?
Fossils of dinosaurs with feathers, I would think.
God's word.
Oh yeah, I forgot. Joel Lindeweber doesn't give a shit about empirical evidence. He just cares about his interpretation of his favorite Iron Age compilation of myths and legends.
Right? We want to start with the Bible.
One of the characteristics of pseudoscience is starting with a conclusion and then working backwards to fit the evidence to that conclusion, rather than starting with the evidence and seeing what conclusions can fit it. When Joel says to start with the Bible, do you think he's being a pseudoscientist who starts with a conclusion, Or do you think he's being a scientist who starts with empirical data?
So what day of creation week were dinosaurs created on? Anybody know? Shout it out.
According to Genesis 1, the land animals were made on day 6, and the flying creatures and sea creatures were made on day 5. But this doesn't really mean anything for the question. Take, for instance, animals like sea turtles, sea snakes, and whales that rarely or never come on land, despite being in groups that are normally thought of as land animals, that is, reptiles and mammals. What day were they made on? What about bats? Presumably they're day 5 animals, but the rest of mammals, apart from whales, are on day 6. So if reptiles as a whole and mammals as a whole can be split between days 5 and 6, why cannot dinosaurs, a subset of reptiles, not be the same way? The flying dinosaurs were made on day 5 and the land-bound dinosaurs on day 6.
Day 6, very good. Genesis 1:25, God made the beasts of the earth according to their kind, and the livestock according to their kind, everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. How about birds? What day of the week did God create birds? 5, very good. Genesis 1:21, so God created every winged bird according to its kind, and God saw that it was good.
Well, first, the word there translated as bird is oaf, which in Leviticus 11 explicitly includes bats. So clearly the word oaf does not have the same semantic range as the English word bird, and means something closer to winged animal that flies, rather than just bird. So bats are created on day 5, but most mammals on day 6. Similarly, we can simply say that birds are created on day 5 and the rest of dinosaurs on day 6 without there being any trouble for this literalist reading of Genesis. This whole argument doesn't even work if we assume the truth of young Earth creationism. It's hard to imagine a worse argument.
So this is just one of many ways you can tell from Scripture that God didn't use evolution, right?
That's not the same question. Did God create dinosaurs with feathers is one question. Are birds dinosaurs is a second question. Did God create via evolution is yet a third question. These can all have different answers, and answering one doesn't answer the others.
There's numerous ways. Evolution takes millions of years. God created in 6 days. That makes it pretty obvious.
Well, it makes it pretty obvious that a literal reading of Genesis 1 is simply not something that corresponds to reality, because here in reality we have overwhelming evidence of universal common ancestry for cellular life and the great antiquity of both the Earth and the universe.
God created things after its kind, right? Animals don't turn into other kinds of animals.
To borrow something from my last video, I pointed out several times before that part of the reason that creationists can't seem to understand even the most basic concepts in evolutionary biology is that their concept of organisms is fundamentally Neoplatonic, but modern biology has found that organisms actually cannot be fit into Neoplatonic forms the way that creationists want them to be. They are simply continuing in the ancient Christian tradition of using ancient Greek philosophical concepts to frame how they see the world. It turns out, at least in the case of Neoplatonism, this philosophy is wrong when applied to living things. There is no form of a dog. Dogs are a lineage within wolves, and there is no essential dogness that exists. There are just organisms whose genomes can vary over time to any degree, but which won't ever stop being dogs, no matter how unrecognizable they might be. The concept of kinds, as Joel is using it, is just some ancient Greek philosophy dressed up in Hebrew clothes that's badly translated into English. It has no biological reality and was not anything like what the authors of Genesis or even creationists until the mid-21st century would recognize.
But I think God has a sense of humor, and just to mess with the evolutionists, he created birds the day before he created dinosaurs, just to make sure we were absolutely clear on that issue.
I can guarantee that no working evolutionary biologist cares at all what the order of creation is in the Bible and bases none of their work on either conforming to that or trying to contradict it. It matters as much to them as the idea of the floodgates of heaven in Genesis 7 matters to working meteorologists. As much as the idea that mating animals near stripy strix results in stripy offspring from Genesis 30 matters to animal breeders.
So Genesis 1:21 says, a winged bird. It can literally be translated flyers or flappers with wings. And it turns out the concept of the wing is pretty important. So let's do a little science. You guys remember the scientific method?
I remember that there isn't simply the one and only scientific method. That's more talk that's characteristic of both creationists and flat earthers. Weird how much alike they are, isn't it? Each branch of science has its own particular method. What they share is empiricism and hypothesis testing.
Let's start with a hypothesis.
About what? I think we have to start with an observation.
And then we are going to make some predictions based on that hypothesis. We're going to test those predictions. and then we'll come to a conclusion. So that's kind of the scientific method.
Maybe if you include observations and you're targeting the explanation to babies, then sure.
So our hypothesis is going to be that God only created feathers on birds.
Well, he'll need to first demonstrate that God created anything at all, a tall order in scientific terms. Then he'll need to define clearly what a bird is, which hasn't happened yet. Then finally, he'll need to show that no other known animals have feathers. That's a lot of stuff to do. I don't think there's time in this talk to even begin.
All right? We'll see if that's true. We're going to test that. That's our hypothesis. Seems like a reasonable hypothesis.
Well, since it's got an entirely untestable aspect to it, that an omnipotent actor did something, it's as unreasonable as any hypothesis could ever be. Anytime you put God in there, regardless of whether or not there is a God, you've made yourself a hypothesis that is completely unscientific, because it's not subject to testing that could falsify it.
When we look at the world today, living animals, we see feathers on birds. We don't see feathers on reptiles.
Birds are reptiles. Remember, when we look around, we see flukes on the tails of whales, but not of mammals. So I guess whales aren't mammals, just like birds aren't reptiles.
When we look at Genesis, we see that God created birds on a different day than he created land animals.
Yet more reason to show that whales aren't mammals, since those are land animals made on day 6, unlike whales which are sea animals made on day 5. How can whales be mammals if they were made the day before mammals, right?
So, seems like a reasonable hypothesis. Well, let's talk about feathers. Feathers do come in different types and variations, but the key thing to remember about feathers is that they're all branching structures.
This is, in fact, not true. Many birds have non-branching feathers called bristles that are used similarly to mammal whiskers as sensory organs. Man, this guy can't even get birds right, never mind all of Dinosauria. Some bristles branch at the proximal end, as on his diagram, others don't.
All right, you can see all the 6 different types there. They all have a main quill, or rachis, and then they all have some type of barbs coming off of them.
Yeah, in that diagram that's true, but in real life, bristles are usually not branching.
So that's an important thing to remember. A feather is always a branching structure.
Except when it's not.
Now we do find things called filaments on some dinosaur fossils. So this is a Sinosauropteryx. It's a compsognathid dinosaur.
That's true.
And you can see those fuzzy things along its neck, right? Those are called filaments, but they aren't branching structures.
Like most bristle feathers. Okay, I'm following so far.
Most likely collagen fibers or something like that.
No, we know for certain that these are not collagen fibers, and we know that for pretty simple reasons. The groundbreaking paper Fossilized Melanosomes and the Color of the Cretaceous Dinosaurs and Birds by Fu-Cheng Zhang et al., published in Nature January 27, 2010, conclusively and directly refuted the claims from Fiducia, Lingam Soliar, and Wang that these are collagen fibers. I really want to impress on you the degree to which it is the case that this paper absolutely deleted this argument from serious consideration in paleontology. So what did this paper do that showed that these specific fibers, along with pretty much the rest of what Fiducia and Pham were complaining about, were definitely not collagen fibers? Well, they found melanosomes. Melanosomes are organelles produced by melanocytes, and they unsurprisingly contain melanin, which is one of the main color molecules in animals. All humans make it to various degrees, except albinos. There are 2 kinds of melanin, eumelanin, which is a very dark brown color, and pheomelanin, which has a rusty reddish-orange color. Melanocytes produce melanosomes, and they are generally expelled from the melanocyte into the surrounding intercellular matrix. But this is where it gets important. This doesn't happen in collagen fibers because those are themselves protein chains, whereas integumentary structures like scales, feathers, and hair do have melanosomes. That's what gives them most of their color, except in cases where structural color is more important, like in most green or blue feathers, and all iridescent feathers. So a good way to tell if these filaments are integumentary structures, like unbranched bristle-type feathers, or if they're just frayed collagen, is to check for melanosomes. No melanosomes means that collagen is a pretty good explanation. Yes melanosomes means that collagen has been ruled out. Well, the researchers found melanosomes, and even found them in patterns like rings on the tail of Sinosauropteryx, and they also found that Sinosauropteryx had raccoon-like bandit markings on its face. Now, this paper came out in 2010, and this talk came out in 2014. So AIG has had 14 years to come up with some argument that's better than the 2007 arguments of Fiducia and Company. They have not done so, because there are no good arguments. This is a lie, and they know it.
We don't know for sure yet, but that's what a lot of scientists think.
We have known for sure for 14 years. Joel is just lying. And by a lot of scientists, he means about as many as even I could count on one hand without running out of fingers.
And so, it doesn't look like feathers. So we've got this difference, right? Filaments, and we've got feathers.
Except that, as we've seen, some feathers are filaments, and in order to get from basal and tegumentary structures like simple placos to complex scales, you're going to have to go through transitional stages. And even before the fossil filaments were found, they were proposed as stage 1 protofeathers. So we expect, if birds are dinosaurs, to also have dinosaurs with the more basal filamentous protofeathers, and that's what we have. That's the transitional feature right there, in the fossil Joel himself showed us.
But evolutionists keep trying to use the word feather to include both.
That's because birds still and have always had filamentous feathers, and even if they hadn't, it would be a required transitional stage, so the only reason not to call these feathers or protofeathers is if you want to lie to people to trick them into thinking there's less evidence for the dinosaurian affinities of avians than there really is. Now, Joel wouldn't do something that's so nakedly propagandistic in order to trick his credulous audience of scientific illiterates, would he?
Right. Well, we're not going to do that in this talk. When I say feather, I mean a branching structure. I'm not talking about filaments.
I'm using a stipulative definition for bird, so I guess I can't tell him he's not allowed to use one for feather. But let's remember that what sounds humans associate with these concepts doesn't actually do anything to change the underlying physical reality or the data that scientists can gather about it.
And when we find feathers in the fossil record, like on this animal on the left, which is a dromaeosaur called Microraptor, and Archaeopteryx on the right, one of the most famous fossils in the world, when we find feathers on them, they're fully formed, complete branching structures, just like birds today.
Okay, but that's entirely because he defined protofeathers out of the feather category. Like, what did I just say about using stipulative definitions and how it doesn't actually change the data? The fact is that we have transitional protofeather structures, and just not using the word feather to refer to them doesn't make them go away. Like, if I decided to redefine human to mean Homo sapiens above the age of 19, that doesn't suddenly mean that humans can't make babies because I can't find any baby humans. The only reason I can't is because I decided to not define babies as humans in my stipulative definition. That doesn't change anything about the life cycle of humans. Similarly, if he just defines protofeathers as not feathers, that doesn't make them go away or mean that we don't find them. It just means he's playing word games when he tries to say that that's what's happening. He knows he can't actually deal with data honestly, so he just does a semantic vanishing act to pretend it doesn't exist. But it does.
So why do evolutionists conflate these two ideas of the filament and the feather into one word?
They don't. They just aren't using Joel's stipulative definition. Because why would they bother? They're not the ones pretending that the data don't exist because they decided to define a word narrowly to let them do so more easily.
Because they're trying to tell a story, right?
Not any more than any other scientists. Joel is showing on screen the stages of feather evolution as they were predicted, and then the dinosaur groups that we have actually found to have physically possessed such feathers. And on top of that, the more modern the feather, the closer the rest of the animal's anatomy is to modern birds. This is, as I've been told, the gold standard in science. It's hard to imagine how much better a transitional sequence could be if you drew an ideal one from scratch. If birds and their feathers had in fact evolved from more basal dinosaurs and dinosaur integuments, what does Joel think it would look like, if not what we have? I don't know.
They're trying to tell a story of how feathers evolved. Feathers are the most complex integumentary structure in creation. They're amazing.
That's true.
But how is that a problem? Paleontologists aren't proposing that feathers on modern birds aren't as complex as they are. In fact, a big part of the reason they predicted protofeather stages is because this complexity probably wasn't present in the basalmost integumentary structures that were homologous to feathers. And instead, the complex branching was probably something that evolved. So that's what scientists hypothesized, and that's what they found in a stunning demonstration of the predictive power of the theory of evolution. Where are the creationist predictions of filamentous tegumentary structures in dinosaurs, and how the pattern of their structures should map onto dinosaur taxonomy? Oh, right, it's so nowhere that they're still lying about the physical structures themselves, some decade and a half after their best argument has been nuked from orbit.
Very complex. And so they need to explain how feathers came from something else.
I mean, yeah, that is kind of the point of evolution.
So you can see stage 1 and 2 in this supposed feather evolution. Those are the filaments, right? And we do find those on some of these dinosaur families in the lower left there.
Importantly, the place where we really start seeing stage 2 feathers are in the Coelurosaurs, the group of theropods that are beginning to have bird-like adaptations, like carpal bones allowing the hand to hold against the ulna, as in birds, as well as metatarsals that, while not fused, are pressed against each other for greater flexibility, like we can see in Tyrannosaurs.
And then stages 4 and 5, those are branching structures. They're feathers. They're just two different types of feathers that we find on birds today. Stage 3, they haven't found those yet.
That's not entirely accurate.
But even if it were, this is just a Dr. Banjo argument.
Fair enough. But where, then, is the missing link between apes and this Darwinius Macilli? Answer me that, Professor.
Oh, okay, granted that one missing link is still missing. But just because we haven't found it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Pshaw! Things don't exist simply because you believe in them.
Further, we have in Sinosauropteryx structures that are actually intermediate between stages 2 and 3, and in Penaraptora, that is oviraptors, Deinonychosaurs, and birds, we have examples of transitions from stage 3 to 4. So while we don't have any completely unambiguous stage 3 protofeathers, we have things that are transitional on either side, and remember, the central aspect of stage 3 is the development of barbules, which are also so delicate that they're not even always preserved in true modern types of feathers when those are preserved. So it's actually quite likely that some of the feathers that currently seem like intermediate stages between 2 and 3 are actually stage 3 feathers.
They're completely hypothetical. This was a diagram based on a diagram from National Geographic magazine, and you can see stage 3 is just a little question mark there. Maybe it happened around here.
Just doubling down on the Dr. Banjo argument, I'd play the clip again, but that seems risky copyright-wise, so I won't. You got the point the first time. But yeah, in any transitional sequence, no matter how complete it is, until we have a fossil of literally every organism ancestral to any living thing alive now, which is impossible, there will be points in the transition that you just don't have. But just like you can still tell what the picture is supposed to be on a 1,000-piece puzzle, even if a few dozen pieces are missing, the fact that all transitional sequences will always be missing a few transitional stages that would be nice to have, doesn't mean you can't figure out the whole picture. And further, the existence of transitional sequences at all are evidence of evolution and against creationism. Now, this is not because they are a dichotomy, they are not. Evidence against evolution is not necessarily evidence for creationism, but because creationism says no evolution, evidence of evolution is evidence against creationism, and confirmed predictions in the form of transitional species in the fossil record are direct evidence against creationism.
So it's very different, and you can see there's two different groups of animals.
I don't even know what two groups of animals he means, although I do notice that his cladogram of theropoda is in fact wildly different than the consensus. In fact, he has tyrannosauroids as maniraptorans in his cladogram, which is absolute nonsense. Ornithomimids and therizinosaurids are Maniraptoriformes, and so should be closer to the Maniraptorans than Tyrannosaurus is, but he's got Tyrannosaurus right next to the true Maniraptors with Oviraptorosauroids, Avians, and Deinonychosaurs. Now this is a mess. This is just chaos.
So if we look at a group of what they would call theropod dinosaurs, these non-avian dinosaurs.
Well, not all theropods are non-avian dinosaurs, but the ones pictured all are. Although the Herosaurids may not be theropods at all, and they're on here.
There's a subgroup inside of there called Maniraptora.
Yep, and it looks like he's correctly identified Maniraptora, although in doing so, he's contradicting his earlier chart that had Therizinosaurus and the related Bapiosaurus being farther away from other Maniraptorans than Tyrannosauroids, and now he's saying that they're just not Maniraptorans, which is correct, but that's incompatible with his chart. So now I'm not actually sure what he believes about what is and isn't in Maniraptora. It's almost like Joel has no clue what he's talking about and can't read a cladogram. Either that, or he really doesn't care about being honest or even coherent.
And if we look at all of the fossils where we find real feathers, they're all found inside of this group. They're all found inside of Maniraptora.
Well, given his stipulated definition that only modern type feathers count, yes, that doesn't negate the fact that protofeathers have been found in many of these other groups, and also strong evidence for some kind of feather-like integumentary structures has been found in many more groups, such as Allosauridia broadly, in the form of quill knobs on the ulna of Concavenator, and even in ornithischians like ornithopods and ceratopsians, who have filamentous structures that are structurally essentially the same thing as stage 1 protofeathers from organisms like Sinornithosaurus. So while it's true that using his definition, Maniraptora, and more specifically Peniraptora, a slightly smaller group, are the only animals with modern-type feathers, that is completely in line with the predictions of evolutionary history.
Now, we do find filaments outside of that group, but just filaments. We don't find feathers outside of that group.
Right, but those filaments match the predicted forms of protofeathers, so the fact that he doesn't want to use the word feather when talking about them doesn't change their transitional nature. After this, he says he's going to jump into the 7 dramatic differences between dinosaurs and birds that we were promised a while ago. As a reminder, this exact logic can be used to argue that whales aren't mammals. And as a further reminder, here are the 7 dramatic differences between whales and mammals that show that whales can't be mammals. 1. Whales have only 2 limbs, mammals have 4. 2. Whales have a tail fluke, mammals don't. 3. Whale pelvises don't connect to the spine, but mammal pelvises do. Whales have flippers, not feet or hands like mammals. 5. Whales have blubber, mammals don't. 6. Whales are born tail first, mammals are born head first. 7. Whales are water animals, but mammals live on land at least sometimes. So if you don't think those are good reasons to kick whales out of the Mammals Club, just remember that when it comes to kicking out birds from the Dinosaur Club. Anyway, here's Joel.
So let's jump into the 7 dramatic differences between dinosaurs and birds.
I am all ready.
There's a lot of diagrams I'm going to show you in this talk, and they're also in this paper. So if you want to do a deep dive on this topic and the anatomy side of things, check out Answers Research Journal, my paper there.
So that paper is written by Joel himself and features his art prominently. I have to say, I think he is a talented artist and is certainly better at digital painting than I am. The paper is all about reconstructing Microraptor as a bird, a term that the paper does not define, and it also does not even argue that Microraptor is a bird. Instead, it simply directs the reader to a source that the body of the text labels Fiducia 2020, which sounds like a peer-reviewed paper from 2020 from Alan Fiducia arguing that Microraptor is a bird. But no, it's not. It's his non-peer-reviewed lay-level book, Romancing the Birds and Dinosaurs, Forays in Postmodern Paleontology, meaning that it's not an academic source even though it is written by a PhD who has published papers before. That's the book that rather famously and hilariously took at face value a blog post by paleontologist Dr. Darren Neisch that he published on April 1st, 2017, that satirically argued that many dinosaur lineages had survived the KPG extinction event. It was a literal joke published on April Fool's Day, and it went into the source that Joel is using as the basis for not just this talk, but also the quote-unquote paper that this is based on. The book also simply dismisses data from multiple studies on the grounds that the conclusions are biased, which is a bit rich coming from the guy who is dismissing data because it doesn't fit his bias. Further, the book has had essentially no impact, having a whopping total of 7 citations on Google Scholar, 1 being Fiducia citing himself, and 2 of them being Darren Neisch's blog post, although one of those 2 is a German translation. That means fully half of the citations are either blog posts critical of Fiducia, or just Fiducia pointing out his own past work. Another one is a review in a Columbian ornithology journal that doesn't seem to be available online anymore. So this talk arguing that birds are not dinosaurs is based on a paper based on a book of more or less no scientific merit. And that paper doesn't even argue that birds are not dinosaurs, nor does it define either group. So this is just an outstanding showing from Answers in Genesis. Also, his paper concludes that Archaeopteryx had a beak, something that not even Alan Fiducia seems to agree on. In fact, in the section in which he argues for a beak, he provides no reason for reconstructing Microraptor with a beak, except that no one can prove it didn't have one, and that it sure would be nice for him if it did. Rather amusingly, he also cites several works that show how beaks can be inferred from the skull anatomy without preserved beak material, then goes on to point out Microraptor lacks any such signs of having had a beak, and then just moves on as if that weren't a problem, because according to him, that work was based on cladistic assumptions, whatever that means.
I also want to give a big shout out to Dr. Haynes for all of the groundwork that she has laid on the research side of things. She's just done an amazing job.
Such an amazing job that even other creationists have put her on blast for one of the shoddiest blog posts creationism has ever seen. I reviewed it, and I reviewed the review of it by other creationists. I'll just say this. Not only is that paper atrociously bad, it revealed that Dr. Haynes doesn't even read the works she cited or can't understand them, doesn't understand how to read a cladogram, and like Joel, is uninterested in actually defining dinosaur. And is okay with calling Archaeopteryx a bird despite it not actually meaning the definition of bird she herself cited and advocated for in the paper. If I had published something that bad in high school, I think I'd just go crawl into a cave and live there for the rest of my life out of embarrassment. Maybe I could live in St. Anthony the Great's cave in Egypt.
So you guys ready? We've got to move fast. All right.
I've been as ready as I can be the whole time.
So, our scientists
don't start with required conclusions. AIG has a statement of faith requiring their employees to start with required conclusions. Therefore, there are and cannot be any answers in Genesis scientists. It is currently a logical impossibility.
Our scientists have done some just incredible work, really studying, going deep into the papers and the fossils and studying all these specimens to try to figure out what's special about birds.
Have they? In what publications? Certainly not Haynes or Lineweber's paper, in which they don't even bother attempting to discuss that and either don't bother saying what a bird even is, or use a definition that contradicts their own use of the term. It's hard for me to imagine an organization that has done or could do a worse job at figuring out what makes birds special. I mean, I could tell you a bunch of reasons off the top of my head, and have already listed a bunch of them in the previous video, and I'm just some dinosaur at a desk, or right now a bee, not someone with millions of dollars of funding. It's almost like Answers in Genesis doesn't actually care about figuring out birds, but they just like being able to say that they are doing it to their donors who are not going to read whole articles in their Answers Research blog.
And guess what? Birds have wings.
Okay.
It's a very deep concept, I know. Birds have wings. And that ties back to that concept we saw in Genesis, right? Wings are important. So, the first 4 criteria we're going to talk about, the first 4 dramatic differences, are related to the wings. And the first one we've already talked about a little bit, wing feathers, right? So, these aren't just random feathers attached to the body. Birds have wing feathers. Feathers, not filaments.
This is starting to sound a whole lot like someone saying whales have baleen, therefore they can't be mammals. And also note that we're still using his stipulative definition of feathers that he has already dishonestly tried to use to exclude proto-feathers from consideration on the mere grounds of his word games. But also, we have evidence of proto-feathers being attached to wing-like patterns from other animals that are not even in Maniraptora, such as Concavenator, which has ulnar knobs that are consistent with quill knobs, and even Ornithomimids, which have feathers that are indeed branching and have a rachis. So, I guess they're feathers. Further, Tyrannosaurs like Eutyrannus are preserved with branching protofeathers that lack a rachis, making them similar to modern down feathers. So, as long as we're not playing word games to trick the audience, we have proto-wings with proto-feathers. And further, what is a wing? Well, it's a funny arm that's used for flying, that's it. It's not some brand new structure with no precursors in the fossil record.
If we look at that Archaeopteryx fossil, you can see the feathers are arranged very beautifully into a wing, just like modern birds today. Same thing with the Dromaeosaur, Microraptor, a wing. Very clearly, wing feathers there.
Yeah, it looks like this arrangement of prominent integumentary structures goes way back farther into Theropoda than even Coelurosauria. Never mind Maniraptora. And we should expect derived theropods closer to modern birds to have a fairly modern-seeming feather arrangement, especially given how far back the basic arrangement goes. This is evidence for birds being dinosaurs, not against it. If birds aren't dinosaurs, then why do we see bird-like structures in animals like Allosauroids and Tyrannosauroids?
This one's a little bit harder to see. This is Caudipteryx. It's an oviraptorosaur. And there's kind of the body outline. They had smaller wings. They were probably flightless, but still, feathers are still arranged in a wing shape.
Of course, there's a problem. How do we know if that's because Caudipteryx is transitional between more basal coelurosaurs and birds, or because it's just a bird that has lost the power of flight? Focusing on just the remiges won't help, because modern flightless birds also typically have symmetrical remiges, like Caudipteryx, as noted on his slide. Well, we check for the derived characteristics shared by birds, such as the Carpometacarpus, Tarsometatarsus, keeled sternum, etc. And we find that Caudipteryx doesn't have most of them, meaning that it fits perfectly into the definition for a transition between basal theropods and derived members of aves, which remember is what Haynes argues should be used as our definition for bird. And Joel here has cited her work, meaning that presumably he agrees with her on that, meaning that Caudipteryx is not only not a bird, but it's a perfect transitional species demonstrating the evolution of birds from theropods.
So here's a diagram of those, some of those animals. This is a dove, and you can see the 3 different groups of feathers there. The primary feathers, which are the feathers attached to kind of those finger bones. The secondary feathers are attached to the arm, the ulna bone. And the alula feathers are attached to that first digit, the gray feathers right there.
Of course, the problem here is that our earliest evidence of alula feathers are from Eoalulavis, which erects the taxon of Alulavis, which combines the enantiornithine dinosaurs along with the avian dinosaurs via the derived trait of having an alula. In fact, Joel's reason stated for giving animals like Microraptor and Caudipteryx alula feathers is that he thinks they had them because reasons and God, and he doesn't like mean evolutionists. He presents literally no evidence that these animals had alula feathers, and I would like to point out that Archaeopteryx, Microraptor, and Caudipteryx are all known from multiple specimens, many of which feature near-perfect feather impressions, and none of them have alula feathers. That presents very strong evidence that they did not have them, because we have fossils with far better preservation than would be needed for them to be observed, and yet we don't observe them. His argument is basically that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, and while that's a fun mantra, it's not actually always true. For example, you can't simply say that because I have no evidence of an elephant in my house that I should remain undecided on whether or not to accept the proposition that there is an elephant in my house. The presence of many things, like elephants and alula feathers, leave behind expected evidence, such as, a visible elephant, dung, a distinct odor, elephant noises in the case of the elephant, and preserved feather imprints in fossils that preserve such in the case of feathers. If the presence of an elephant should produce certain observable facts that are absent, it is reasonable to conclude that there is no elephant, and it would require extraordinary positive evidence to overcome that conclusion. Similarly, if there is no evidence of alula feathers, even in fossils where the animal's thumb and other remages are clearly and exceptionally preserved, then it requires positive evidence of an alula to conclude that they existed. We have no such evidence.
If we look at the feathers on Microraptor, the dromaeosaur, again, same type of arrangement, right? Very similar to modern birds, arranged in a fan shape, got all these different things that make it just like a bird.
Yeah, including a completely made-up alula.
Same thing with Caudipteryx.
Right down to the made-up thumb feathers.
The feathers are shaped a little bit different. The wing is a little bit different shaped because different birds have different shaped wings based on how they fly. But
Caudipteryx doesn't actually meet the definition of a bird in the sense of member of Aves. So ignoring the things he's making up, what does calling Caudipteryx a bird mean for the evidence for birds being dinosaurs? Literally nothing. Nothing about any definition for dinosaur that has ever been proposed includes not having primary and secondary feathers attached to digit 2 of the manus and the ulna. In fact, adding that would be special pleading. So is Caudipteryx a dinosaur? Well, yeah, it has all the features of a dinosaur, as well as some of the features of a bird. Sounds like a transitional fossil to me.
Still, bird. They're not feathers that are randomly attached to the body or something like that, evolving, partially functional. These are fully formed wings.
Well, first, no one really expects to see individual feathers just sticking out of random places. Feathers follow feather lines, which themselves are just areas of skin that have distinct developmental signals related to integument. You see the same basic thing across reptilia. Snakes have specific belly scales and face scales. Crocodilians have very distinct regions for their scutes, and the scutes in these regions have very different shapes. Some such regions include the flanks, the belly, and several such lines going down the back all the way to the tail. This means that we should expect that if birds are reptiles and their feathers are homologous to the scales and scutes of other reptiles, that they should always have been occurring along such lines. And yeah, that's what we see. Joel here is just strawmanning evolution. Further, note that he says they're not half-formed feathers, instead they're fully branching feathers. Well, that means that, at least in this case, we can understand what he means by half or not fully formed feathers. He means feathers that don't branch. But the problem is that he already just, by fiat, declared that such structures aren't feathers. So when he sees what actually are half-formed feathers, he just declares that they're not feathers and then moves on. It's basically just a thought-stopping technique. It's literally cult behavior.
And another thing that birds have around their wings is something called patagia. And this soft tissue, the red and the blue you can see there, the red is the propatagia and the blue is the postpatagia. And it's a complex system of tendons, ligaments, and nerves that automatically fold the wing feathers when the wing closes.
There's skin involved too, but sure.
And it connects to the skeleton. It's really a remarkable system, so that the bird, basically when the bird stretches out its elbow, the wing automatically opens up. And when it closes its elbow, the wing automatically folds.
He's right, and you can even see this next time you cook a bird. Take the wing and hold it by the upper part over the humerus and then below the elbow. Then flex the elbow joint, and you'll see the hand also flexes.
It's just an amazing structure that God created. So, if these feathered manoraptors are birds,
which they're not, even according to the paper from Haynes he cited,
we would expect to find evidence of something like this in the fossil record, right?
Well, yes, but we would also expect to find it in non-bird dinosaurs if birds evolved from dinosaurs. And so we do. Pointing to dinosaurs that have some but not all of the features of modern birds is pointing to transitional fossils that should not exist if special creation were true, but that are predicted by the theory of evolution. Just calling these animals birds doesn't actually change that. It's just a word game.
Well, guess what we find? On several of these feathered maniraptors, we find evidence of this soft tissue. You can see it there. This is Anchiornis. And not only do we find kind of that body outline of that, we also find little feather follicles in the skin if you use the right kind of light on this fossil. And that's significant because
it's a feature unique among extant animals to birds, which also share a whole suite of characteristics in common that Anchiornis lacks, meaning that no matter whether you call it a bird or not, it's transitional.
This is something that evolutionists don't talk about when they talk about feather evolution.
Yeah, that's going to be a citation needed.
You can see in that diagram, that little picture on the right there, every feather in the skin of a bird each has nerves, blood vessels, and muscles that attach to it.
Yeah, that's pretty standard for the outside structures of animals. Turtles can feel touch, including pain on the horny exterior of the carapace, and some even seem to enjoy gentle petting or scratching from humans. Mammal hair also has a blood supply and nerves. Even the scales and scutes of other reptiles have sensory nerves and blood supply to the living portions under the outermost layers. Feathers are only different in degree.
So there's a whole network system of the nervous system and the blood vessels and the muscles to control these feathers individually in some cases, and to be able to grow these feathers, to be able to release them, to be able to grow another one in its place. And it's a sensory system, so that when a bird is flying, kind of like if somebody touches the hairs on your arm or something like that, you can feel it, right? Birds have that with their feathers.
Is Joel just unfamiliar with the concept of integument? This is all stuff that integument has always been doing, even in the common ancestor of, all chordates, probably. None of this is surprising, and far from being some problem for the evolution of birds from dinosaurs, it was something dinosaurs themselves inherited back from hundreds of millions of years ago. All that's happening with feathers is that the muscles and nerves and blood that have always been part of the integumentary system, or skin if you will, are concentrating around particular structures. Further, we don't have evidence that the most primitive feathers, those on animals like Eutyrannus or Sinosauropteryx, had such complex innervation musculature or blood supply. So this also lines up with evolution. Features don't evolve in simple isolation. It's not like dinosaurs needed to evolve the exterior shape of asymmetrical flight remiges, and only after that's done can they work on evolving muscles to control their orientation. And only once both of those are done can they bother with a blood supply. And then finally on nerve endings or something. As the complexity of feathers increase, so do their metabolic needs. So blood supply to them will be advantageous because it keeps the feather for longer. Similarly, they started out with some sensory apparatus, and so innervation will increase to the degree it's a selective advantage to do so, which will increase as the structures become more and more important for a population's survival. Similarly, the degree to which the orientation of the integument is important is the degree to which it will evolve finer muscle control. As a non-bird example, look at North American porcupines. They can control the orientation of their quills based on the situation, and when they are calm and happy, their quills lie flat and you could almost forget they have them. But when they are angry, scared, or grumpy, they can raise their quills and become a pincushion of fury. Similarly, if your feathers are just downy feathers, there for basic insulation, you don't need much in the way of control over their orientation, and simple erector muscles like mammals have are probably plenty. But as soon as the feathers play any role at all in aerodynamics, then any increased control over their orientation can be selected for, since that will help with the aerodynamics.
So they can feel where the wind is so that they can adjust mid-flight. It's really remarkable.
Sure, it's remarkable. I just fail to see why that's a problem for evolution. In fact, it raises a question about this kind of objection from creationists. The basic form of the objection is to point to something about a living organism, proclaim how cool it is, and then to simply declare without much further reasoning that this is a problem for evolution. But this implies that there are some aspects of living organisms that aren't a problem. Otherwise, why single out some aspects of a particular organism? So, what do creationists think isn't a problem for evolution?
So, difference number one between dinosaurs and birds. Birds have feathers on their wings.
Right, but that's only true if you change what people mean by bird. Look, here's the restrictive version of bird that Haynes argued for in her paper, even though she got wrong what the definition actually was. It's the one I'm using in this series. It's class aves. Here's the term as it often gets used in the discussion, and it's basically aviale. But Joel is arguing for an even broader definition, Maniraptora. But as you can see on the cladograms, none of these definitions actually stops birds from being Coelurosaurs, Tetanurans, Neotheropods, Theropods, Saurischians, dinosaurs, ornithodyrans, archosaurs, or reptiles. All he's done is redefine what a bird is to include winged dinosaurs that otherwise wouldn't be considered birds. That's wordplay, not evidence. No matter what you call Microraptor, it remains transitional between the dinosaur ancestors of birds and modern members of class Aves.
All right, difference number 2. Swivel wrist. All right, hold up your arm for me. All right, keep your arm straight and try to bend your wrist to the side.
I can't. As a ceratosaur, my wrists are actually exceptionally inflexible in any orientation. On the other hand, though, I have fingers that can flex backwards to an almost silly degree. You win some, you lose some.
How about you? I can't get past 45 degrees, or thereabouts.
I'm not sure I can even get to 1 degree.
That's because I have a human wrist, not a bird wrist. A bird wrist can fold all the way up beside its body. It can almost touch the finger bones to the side of the arm.
That's true.
That's because it has a swivel wrist. It's got a special bone in its wrist called a semilunate carpal. It's a half-moon-shaped bone, and that allows that wrist to swivel sideways. A bird can't really do this. Their wrist doesn't bend that way. It bends the other way. It swivels.
It also can't rotate. Most media depictions of dinosaurs have broken wrists. It's especially prominent in Jurassic Park, where the poor raptors are nude and broken-wristed. Jurassic Park really is a horror movie, even from the perspective of the poor dinosaurs.
So, if these feathered manoraptors are birds,
something that not even AIG was pushing just a few years ago,
our prediction is we would expect to see what? A swivel wrist in these animals, right?
Except that wasn't a prediction creationists made. There were no creationists out there predicting that manoraptors should have semilunate carpals. Indeed, in 2015, when the late David Menton gave a talk about this subject, he didn't even mention the idea, even though in April of 2020, suddenly he was claiming that all manoraptors were birds. So the prediction should have been made sometime between 2015 and 2020, which would be all well and good, except that you might remember this.
And look at the half-moon-shaped bones on the wrist. It's no wonder these guys learn how to fly.
How did this idea get into the public consciousness enough that it made it into the 1993 film Jurassic Park? It's because far from being a prediction of creationists, the presence of the semilunate carpal in manoraptors, or at least a subset of them, was well established some 40 or so years ago as of the time of this writing. For example, the 1982 paper, The Reptilian Relationships of Archaeopteryx by Ra Fulborn and T.L. Hanley, published in the Australian Journal of Zoology, indicates evidence for a semilunate carpal in several non-avian, in the traditional sense, dinosaurs, including Deinonychus, Velociraptor, and Synonychosaurus. So this isn't something that creationists predicted, this is something they're trying to accommodate while still pretending that birds aren't dinosaurs.
Well, what do we find? That's exactly what we find. So you see, there's the chicken with the swivel wrist, Sapiornis, which is an extinct bird, and Microraptor. They all have the same bone and this swivel wrist functionality. So they have the ability to kind of close their wing.
Oh look, creationists have discovered something some 42 years after everyone else discovered that same thing. Talk about cutting-edge research. Also, at least as of 2021, Answers in Genesis was giving mixed messages on this, as can be seen in this video, uploaded to YouTube March 31st, 2021. You can clearly see a raptor animatronic labeled as such that is definitely not portraying the animal as a bird. Since I wanted to see if it was still there, on October 29th, 2024, I called the guest services line at the Creation Museum and inquired about the animatronic. It is indeed still there. Maybe someone should let them know that they're contradicting themselves. Or not. I actually find it funnier this way.
Now, if you look at the dinosaur wrist there on Allosaurus, it's very different. It doesn't bend that way. And that's consistent across all the theropod dinosaurs that we see here that are not birds. And so...
Except that it's not, though, is it? The kind of flexion that Joel is portraying as characteristic of birds is called abduction. And you can measure about how much abduction is possible in an animal's wrists with degrees. Modern birds can come close to 180 degrees of abduction. But the degree of abduction actually increases in dinosaurs well before we get to Maniraptora, as you get closer and closer to birds. Basal theropods probably had almost 0 degrees of abduction, but by the time that we get to Coelurosauria, the group that includes Tyrannosaurus and Compsognathids, as well as others, that is to say 4 of his 6 examples of dinosaurs, we find that the minimum abduction ability was probably around 15 degrees. By the time we get to Maniraptora, it has increased, but not even doubled. It's up to only 25 degrees for animals like Therizinosaurs and Oviraptorosaurs. Even in Microraptor, a flying non-avian dinosaur that AIG has long thought of as a bird, we only get to about 60 degrees of abduction. So, through the whole theropod line leaning to birds, we see slowly increasing abduction of the wrist, just like you might predict if birds are dinosaurs. It turns out that Joel just declaring anybody with about 25 degrees of abduction or more a bird doesn't really do anything to change the transitional sequence we see in wrist morphology.
You can see that bottom row, those are all different dinosaur wrists, and they function a little bit more like a human wrist. They have the ability to grasp.
So do most of the so-called bird hands there, including the juvenile Watzine. The only ones that don't are Anser, a goose, and Struthio, the ostrich.
But all of these feathered Maniraptorans have a swivel wrist. And this is a big problem for evolution.
Ah yes, discoveries that are in line with the hypothesis that birds are dinosaurs, which was proposed on the basis of evolutionary biology, are bad for evolution. Just like the increasing global temperatures are bad for climate science, which has been warning about such increases for decades. This checks out, and isn't at all a completely insanely brain-dead take.
Because somewhere along the way, this is a quote from an evolutionist, somewhere along the way from early dinosaurs to birds, wrists changed so much that we could be excused for thinking birds don't even have them.
Weird way of putting it, but okay.
Wrists went from straight to bent and hyperflexible, allowing birds to fold their wings neatly against their bodies when not flying. Underlying this change is a drop in the number of wrist bones from 9 to just 4.
So, how surprised would you be to learn that this quotation is literally the first two sentences of the abstract of the paper? Well, you shouldn't be surprised at all, because it is. The paper itself, which is linked in the description, is in fact about establishing homology in dinosaur carpal bones and supports the homology of the semilunate carpal as being a combination of two distal theropod carpals that fuse embryonically before ossification, which is supported by staining and embryological studies. The abstract of a paper sets up the question the paper is going to try to answer, or the problem is going to try to solve. Anytime you see someone quoting the first bits of an abstract and then simply accepting those statements as if they're the conclusion of the paper, that person is lying to you. Either they didn't read the paper and are pretending to by citing it, or they did read it and they're lying to you about what it says, because a citation implies that you read the cited work. So, let me know in the comments if Joel is lying about the paper or about having read the paper. If you think he's not lying, then please let me know what kind of stupidity he has that would result in him blatantly misrepresenting this paper.
He doesn't offer a lot of explanation of how this happened.
Really? This is from the paper. Quote, this time the researchers found that immunofluorescent staining for collagen supported paleontologists, strengthening the link between dinosaurs and birds. Like the first bird wrist bone, the second had two distinct regions of expression of both types of collagen. Accordingly, the researchers suggest that embryologists join paleontologists in calling the second bird wrist bone the semilunate. Next up is a bone of even greater contention. Some paleontologists call the third bird wrist bone, which is on top and away from the body, distal carpal 3. But embryologists believe that the third bone is entirely new. They call it element X, and view it as taking the place of a bone called the ulnare that is lost in bird development. It is true that the ulnare is fleeting in embryonic birds and is gone completely in adults, but the researchers found that the ulnare and element X coexist briefly in embryos of 7 bird species, and that the embryonic position of the latter corresponds with that of distal carpal 3. These findings refute the notion that element X is a new bone that replaces the ulnare. Rather, the researchers suggest that embryologists join paleontologists once again and use the term distal carpal 3 for the third bird wrist bone. However, paleontologists didn't win this round completely. They believe bird-like dinosaurs still had the bone that disappears in birds, but the researchers' re-examination of the fossil evidence showed that the ulnare had actually already been lost in the most bird-like dinosaurs, further strengthening the dinosaur-bird link. Last, the researchers sorted out the fourth and trickiest of the bird wrist bones, which is on the bottom and away from the body. This is the bone that gives the bird its bent shape and extreme outward flexibility. Paleontologists call the fourth bone the ulnare. On the other hand, developmental studies suggest that this bone is the pisiform, which is the wrist version of the kneecap. The fourth bird wrist bone is key to flight, transmitting force on the downstroke while restricting flexibility on the upstroke. This time, embryologists won. The pisiform is connected by a tendon to a particular muscle in the arm from lizards to mammals, and immunofluorescence for the tendon protein tenascin revealed that the same is true in bird embryos. Paleontologists can be somewhat forgiven for their mistake, however, because the pisiform is not evident in fossils of most bird-like dinosaurs. The researchers square the paleontological and developmental evidence by proposing that the pisiform was either tiny or failed to ossify in bird-like dinosaurs, but was then reacquired in birds. Such evolutionary reversals are rare, but not unprecedented. Besides illuminating how birds got the wrists that helped them fly, this work shows the benefits of combining paleontology and embryology to piece together evolution." End quote. Wow, sounds like explaining this is exactly what the paper did, and unlike Joel, who quoted the abstract, I bothered to actually quote the body of the paper. Also, the author, Robin Meadows, is a woman, and Joel just misgendered her.
This is a big problem for evolution. Like, what benefit would that give to an animal to completely re-engineer its wrist so it can bend sideways before it can even fly? Doesn't make sense.
There are a number of possibilities, like injury avoidance while running, which Maniraptors seem to do a fair bit. There's also the possibility that it allowed for low-energy prey capture motions in the forearm, something we know Maniraptors did. Since it also stiffens the wrist in a way that prevents pronation, supination, flexion, and extension to any significant degree, it also made the wrists less prone to injury. But even if we don't know exactly what selection pressures led to the semilunate carpal, we still have the transitions in the fossils and the embryological support to say that it happened.
In fact, it creates a very nonsensical creature. You've got an animal that has that's supposed to be hunting with these large forelimbs that it's supposedly evolved.
This is actually a reconstruction of Archaeopteryx by Mark Turner from 2016 from Alamy. I can't find any evidence of it being used in a paper or of it being commissioned or used by a paleontologist, so using this as a consensus reconstruction is, as far as I can tell, a straw man. But let's see what the straw man is in full.
But then it's got these big feathers coming off the fingers that get in the way.
Get in the way of what? That's Archaeopteryx. Those feathers are for flying.
And when it tries to grasp something, it can't actually grasp. It has to pull its arms in and swivel the wrist sideways. It doesn't make sense at all.
As it extends the arms, the hands swivel out, allowing the fingers to flex and pull things toward the body. As the arms come in, the hands fold via abduction, pushing the item away from being held just against the chest, allowing more room for the head and neck to get at what is being clutched. This is the basic Maniraptoran prey capture arm motion, and it's very similar to modern bird wing strokes. This is how flapping evolved. Joel just keeps showing us reasons birds are dinosaurs, and then saying, nuh-uh.
So, number 2 major difference is swivel wrist.
You know, for someone trying to say that the wrist is a reason birds aren't dinosaurs, he sure showed a lot of reasons why they are.
But there's 2 more for the wings. Number 3, stabilized shoulder. All right, we've been at this a while. This is the 4th session for some of you, and
it's the first session for me.
And you might be getting a little weary, so do me a favor and just shrug it off, okay? Shrug it, and roll your shoulders back.
I can't do that. I'm not an ape.
Roll them forward. All right, very good. You guys are awesome. All right, feel a little better. Take a deep breath. All right, what you just did, all that motion in your shoulder, you can do that because the only skeletal element, the only bone attaching your arm to the rest of your body is your collarbone. It's just this little bone right here, and it can move around quite a bit.
Has Joel not heard of the scapula, the shoulder blade? What does he think that attaches to? Because it has muscular and tendon attachments to the spine.
Birds can't shrug their shoulders. Did you know that? They can't shrug their shoulders at all. Their shoulders are locked into place.
That's true.
With their rib cage and the rest of their body. They can move their neck a lot, but not their shoulders. Why is that? There's a really good reason for that. If you grew feathers on your arms and tried to fly like a bird, you would have a big problem. You'd most likely dislocate your shoulder and break your collarbone.
People don't generally manage to just break their pectoral girdles from vigorous arm motions, so I'm going to press X to doubt.
Because your shoulder is not built for flight. Flapping is a big deal to a bird. And so they need a stabilized shoulder joint that can handle all of those forces of flapping. It's a very rigorous activity. And so that's what birds have. This is a goose skeleton, and you can see this is the shoulder. The black bone is the scapula. The gray bone is the humerus, which is the first bone in the wing. And then they've got this special bone called the coracoid, which is in blue.
Is it special if basically all tetrapods, except for most but not all mammals, have it? I mean, it's got a specialized shape, but then so do most animals with most of their bones.
And that bone works with the furcula and the scapula to create a tripod-type structure, which is a really strong engineering structure. So the shoulder is kind of attached to this tripod, and so it's very stable, right? And that shoulder doesn't move. And you can see that angle. You've got that angle between the scapula and the coracoid, and that adds to that stability.
I mean, he's not wrong. I'm just wondering what he thinks makes this a problem for identifying birds as dinosaurs. If it's the wishbone, well, many dinosaurs, including Tyrannosaurus rex, had wishbones. I'm not aware of any dinosaurs that don't have a coracoid and scapula, so I am at a loss as to where he is going with this.
Dinosaurs don't have this.
Unless this is something other than a coracoid bone, they certainly do. He even highlighted it, albeit in a different color.
So this is an Allosaurus shoulder. It has a coracoid bone, but it's almost like it's just an extension of the scapula. In fact, in some cases, they're so fused it's hard to see the line between them.
But bird coracoids are also strongly fused to the scapula. The bones together form the socket the humerus goes into, and if they weren't strongly fused in birds, then the bone would just fall out of the socket.
So what would our prediction be? Our prediction would be that if these feathered Maniraptors are birds, we would expect to see a reinforced shoulder joint, like what birds have.
Right, but they don't. At least not in a way that's all that much like a bird. Here's figure 1 from the paper Comments on the Morphology of Basal Paravian Shoulder Girdle, new data based on unilagid theropods and paleognath birds. You might notice that there is actually a wide variation in Maniraptoran coracoid anatomy, with the basal most seeming much more like Allosaurus than one finds in, say, even fairly basal birds like the rhea.
Alright, so there's our goose, there's our Allosaurus. There's Cathiornis, which is an extinct bird. You can see it's got the angled scapula and coracoid bones there. And there's our Dromaeosaur, Microraptor. Same thing. It's a little bit slightly different shape, but it looks nothing like the dinosaur. It looks very avian, looks very bird-like. It's got a reinforced shoulder joint.
Okay, so if we go outside Maniraptora, we won't find this strut-like coracoid. Well, Struthiomimus seems to have had a coracoid that's strut-like if we rotate the figure to the same orientation, and it's not a Maniraptoran, which is what he thinks the word bird means. On the other hand, I'd argue that Deinonychus, from the same figure, isn't strut-like, even though it is a Maniraptoran. And of course, when we get farther from birds than even the ornithomimids, which Joel doesn't consider birds, we get to his example of basal coracoids. How about just within Coelurosauria, we can see that coracoids get more strut-like as you get closer to Maniraptora, and then within Maniraptora, they become even more like the coracoids of modern birds as you get closer to them phylogenetically. It's hard to see how this isn't evidence for evolution, rather than a problem for evolution.
Let's extend that out. You can see of the dinosaurs across the bottom, they all have those rounded coracoid bones that are just an extension of the scapula, don't have that extra stability. And across the top, you can see there's some variation, but they've all got some more of an angle and more of an elongated coracoid bone.
Too bad he's cherry-picking and avoiding intermediate coracoids. It's almost like if he didn't cherry-pick, he wouldn't have an argument.
If you look at that ostrich on the far top right, you can see that the angle's not very sharp. Why would that be?
Because ostriches don't fly, but that's another point in favor of evolution from where I'm standing.
Well, ostriches can't fly, right? So they don't need as much of that stability, so it has a broader angle. And so we see that in some of these extinct animals too, like Caudipteryx. The angle's not quite as strong. It was most likely flightless.
Yes, but the coracoid is also shorter, and also animals like Caudipteryx are missing other features of modern birds, such as the extensive bone fusion, keel, inverted hallux, etc. This argument for Caudipteryx not being transitional because of the angle between the longest axis of the scapula and that of the coracoid only works if you take that one feature in isolation. If you even look at the rest of the shoulder girdle, it doesn't really work. And if you look at the rest of the animal, it becomes obvious that this is an argument that cannot be used in good faith.
But it still doesn't look like a dinosaur shoulder.
In what way? Look, here's a bird shoulder from a modern bird. One of the things I want to draw your attention to is the way that the coracoid fuses into the sternum. This is how all modern birds are, and yet another skeletal characteristic that could be fairly used to define crowned birds. Look at these non-avian Maniraptoran shoulder girdles. None of them do this. The scapula and sternum sure connect, but they aren't fused like in the birds. If we want to isolate just coracoid angle, sure, we can do that. And of course, the more bird-like the animal, the more bird-like the shape of the coracoid will be. But to say that these non-avian Maniraptors have shoulders that are more like a bird's than those of more basal dinosaurs like Allosaurus is just wildly incorrect. It's hard to even comprehend the level of either not checking or outright dishonesty it takes to make this claim. Yes, the scapula and the sternum interface, but not nearly as completely or with the flange shape interface seen in birds. I don't see how you come to this conclusion honestly, unless you're just very motivated in your reasoning.
And it's really cool, the muscle system that birds have around their shoulder joint. They've got a really elaborate pulley system in their shoulder.
Which virtually no Maniraptorans have, except those actually in aves. Even most aviolans don't have a pulley system like modern birds.
So they have a muscle that attaches to the sternum, and it loops up through something called the triosteal canal and attaches to the humerus and helps raise the wing. It's a pulley system. So how did a dinosaur shoulder with a usual deltoid muscle that just helped raise the arm loop through a canal to create a completely different muscle structure? It even reversed the direction that it was pulling.
That's a great question if the answer is, how did some birds evolve this structure? But there are a few things to address first. The big one is that Joel is just making up a cartilaginous Chelon microraptor that he has no evidence for. Something to note is that fundamentally, the supracoracoideus is the same muscle as the deltoid. It has just shifted to be attached down at the sternum rather than simply terminating at the anterior margin of the coracoid and the anteroventral margin of the scapula. So where does this idea of Microraptor having a supracoracoideus elevator come from? Well, it's Joel's Posts and Answers research blog. He simply decided that since Manoraptor is a bird by his fiat, that it must have the features of a bird, and now he's using the features of a bird that he made up based on thinking it is a bird to now argue that it is a bird. You might notice that that's just blatant question begging. Further, a group of animals you may have heard of are the enantiornithines. The name means opposite bird, and what's opposite about them, you might ask? Well, it's exactly this. They don't have supracoracoideus elevators, rather that muscle is an abductor. So if not having supracoracoideus-based elevation of the wing is a problem for science, it's just as much a problem for Joel, given that according to him it's a characteristic of birds, but most fossil Manoraptoran groups lack it. As far as how the supracoracoideus itself specifically evolved, it's not very well documented from what I can tell. That being said, as an embryo grows, it can shift muscle attachments, and since there's a continuous extent of bone from the coracoid down to the end of the sternum, all that really needs to happen is for the deltoid to keep progressing its attachment point further down. As this happens, the coracoid tuber can help it be stabilized, hence why it's so prominent in modern birds. But further, the source he relies on in his paper, one I've already referenced, that is, Comments on the Morphology of Basal Paravian Shoulder Girdle, new data based on unilagid theropods and paleognathed birds, concludes that the muscle in question was not a wing elevator, but rather a protector, as I stated earlier. That is, it swung the wing forward, not up. But hey, it used the magic word supracoracoideus a whole lot, so I guess that means Microraptor had a wing that elevated the way modern bird wings do, except no, that directly contradicts his source. And of course, that paper actually finds support, not problems, for the identity of birds as dinosaurs. I know that was all very technical, but to dumb it down, he's making up anatomy in Microraptor for which we have no evidence, and it's at least the second time he's done so. Further, his own source does not actually support his contention.
So, Microraptor, if you look at that, the latest research indicates that Microraptor and these other feathered Manoraptorans had a similar pulley structure.
Similar, yes. The same as on birds? No.
So their shoulder was very much bird.
You know, except when it wasn't, which is rather what you'd expect if birds are dinosaurs, that you would find animals with bird-like traits that aren't quite what we find on modern birds. And lo and behold, Joel has helped us confirm that that is indeed what we do find.
So, our third major difference is that stabilized shoulder.
And he still hasn't shown how, even if what he said about any of them were 100% true, that would be a problem for identifying birds as dinosaurs.
All right, one more wing difference, and that is the shoulder joint. Okay?
I feel like that's what we were just going over, but okay, I'm going to need a stiff drink after this. I should prep a very stiff, very dry martini. Maybe it can be a bit dirty in honor of the dirty tactics of creationists.
All right, make like you're going to do a chicken dance. All right, and then raise your shoulders. Okay, raise your arms up. Get your elbows up. See how high you can go.
I'm a bee. I can't even get my arm that high. Stupid ape supremacist.
All right, so you can get up there a little ways. If you straighten your arms out, interestingly, you can raise your arms up higher, right? So that's what a bird needs, right? They need a wide range of motion in their arm, right? In their wing. And so that's what we see in birds. This is a kind of a cross-section through a bird, a European starling. And you can see the coracoid and the furcula bone, those two white bones. And then you can see the blue part, which is the range of motion of the humerus, okay?
Okay, but I also noticed that starling has a very prominent deltoid pectoral crest, like is characteristic of dinosaurs. I wonder if we'll ever hear about that.
And then there's that red with the little arrow. It's called a glenoid, a lateral-facing glenoid. And so that's just the fancy word for the socket that shoulder attaches into, right?
That's true.
And it needs that range of motion. So that glenoid, that socket that is in the shoulder, it's located high on the body, and it's angled sideways so that they have a wide range of motion. Well, let's look at a dinosaur shoulder. This is our Allosaurus. You think it could flap?
No, I don't think it could flap, but no one is suggesting that Allosaurus is a bird. Like, the argument is apparently that birds can't be dinosaurs unless all dinosaurs are birds. But that doesn't make any sense. Birds are a subset of dinosaurs. Like, think about this argument applied to bats. Bats, like birds, have to be able to flap, and so need to be able to raise their arms past their spines. Now, basically, no mammals, even apes, can do this apart from bats. Bats also have laterally facing glenoids. And other mammals do not. I mean, have you ever seen a moose or a tiger or a pangolin flap its arms like a bat? No, you have not. So, do we draw the conclusion that bats are not mammals? No, we don't, because nothing about glenoid facing is part of the definition of mammal. Is this even evidence against bats being mammals? No, it's not. But this just comes back to what we've been going on about the whole time. He never bothered to tell us what a dinosaur is in the first place, so of course, he can't actually make arguments that birds aren't dinosaurs. Instead, all he can do is show reasons why birds may be unique among dinosaurs. But that's it. Being unique among a group doesn't negate your membership in that group. Ankylosaurs are unique among dinosaurs for their acetabula that close as they grow up, and for their heavy armor and spikes. That doesn't make them not dinosaurs, even though I can point to things about them that no other dinosaur has. Similarly, primates are unique among mammals for their entirely enclosed forward-facing orbits. Does this make primates not mammals? No, of course not. But if I wanted to say that snakes are not mammals, how would I do it? Well, I wouldn't point out unique features of snakes, like their elongated body and only one functional lung, or their weirdly flexible jaw joints, or their lack of eyelids. All of those are things that could keep snakes as mammals, just very strange ones. Instead, I would point out things like that they don't give milk. I point out what they lack, and that what they lack are the very traits that make mammals mammals. Snakes lack a dental squamosal jaw joint, they lack hair, they lack mammary glands, they lack a division between the thoracic and lumbar vertebrae, etc. That's why they're not mammals. It's what they lack, not what they have. So what do dinosaurs characteristically have that birds don't? Well, basically nothing. Despite Fiducia's attempt to say that lacking a supraacetabular crest means that bird acetabula are no longer perforate, I don't even know how to parse that one as making sense.
No, definitely not. Not only does it have a much smaller arm, forelimb, but it's angled down, it's located lower on the body. So,
since birds evolved from dinosaurs, we should expect to see dinosaurs that lack avian features. We do. I wouldn't exactly call that a slam dunk for avian evolution among dinosaurs, since if birds aren't dinosaurs, we should still also see dinosaurs that lack particularly avian features. But it's certainly not a problem.
How about some of these feathered manoraptors? What do they look like? Well, here's Microraptor.
Yes, no one is surprised that a derived Parabian dinosaur had at least some flight capability, and could flap its arms. But was that true of more distant relations like oviraptors? No, it wasn't. And again, just moving the word bird to become identical to Manoraptoran doesn't negate the fact that as you go farther and farther from crowned birds, among the Manoraptorans, the less lateral the glenoid is. And Joel can't say that's just because they're flightless birds, because flightless birds typically retain the lateral facing of the glenoid, as you can see in this picture of a kakapo with its wings well past its spine, or this flightless cormorant in a similar position of the wings. Even ostriches retain the ability to lift their wings well past the spine, as they do so during courtship displays. Do you think that Joel will show the contrary examples among Manoraptors? Or do you think he'll just cherry-pick the ones that are far closer to birds than, say, Oviraptorosaurs, and never mention that not all Manoraptors have laterally oriented glenoids, therefore ruining this argument? Let me know in the comments.
Shoulder is located high on the body. You can see the coracoid and the sternum there.
And I noticed that in Microraptor, the interface between the coracoid and the sternum has both bones being convex, unlike in crown birds, where the interface is convex for the coracoid, but concave on the sternum. Why is there such a weaker connection in Microraptor? That's not how it is in any avians. It's almost like Microraptor is transitional.
And the glenoid is pointing out. It's got that wide range of motion. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to see even on the side view.
No, it's not, because the main motion in flapping is more or less linear when viewed laterally. When viewed perpendicular to the lateral view facing either the back or the front of the animal, the motion describes a wide arc. Joel must be about as good at understanding 3 dimensions as the average flat earther.
You can see the Allosaurus there. All it can do, its arm is just pointed down and to the rear of the animal. Just got a little range of motion there, not a lot. But
it's not a bird, and so we shouldn't expect it to have a bird-like range of motion. And since facing of the glenoid has never been a diagnostic criterion for dinosaurs, this whole thing is rather pointless.
The Microraptor and the starling have a broad range of motion for their wing, right? And you need that to be able to fly.
Hence why we shouldn't be surprised that dinosaurs that couldn't fly, including within Maniraptora, didn't have this feature.
And that's consistent across these feathered Maniraptors.
And of course, yeah, he just cherry-picked an example from Maniraptora and ignored the counterexamples. You know, ignoring relevant evidence is a hallmark of pseudoscience.
So, there's our first 4. Feathers, swivel wrist, stabilized shoulder, and that specialized shoulder joint.
And even if he were right about all of them, which he wasn't, none of them are reasons that birds aren't dinosaurs. They're all just features that make birds unique among dinosaurs.
So we took these, and we said, okay, let's analyze these across 157 different species of non-avian dinosaurs. Okay.
I'm curious to know where his results were published, because it's definitely not in his paper that is the basis for this whole talk.
And then the first row there is birds. So blue is all bird characteristics, green is all dinosaur characteristics.
So when he said we, he meant Turner et al. Way to take credit for the works of others, Joel. Also, notice how there are actually 4 taxa up there that mix what he calls dinosaur traits with bird traits, that being Oviraptorosaurs, Scansorgopterigidae, which Joel has spelled incorrectly, Coelurosauria as a whole, which is weird since all the other taxa are groups of Coelurosaurs, and also Therizinosaurs. Even his own data analysis, which we already know to be biased since he can't tell the difference between a uniquely bird trait and the lack of a defining dinosaur trait, shows transitional forms. Absolutely stunning.
And you can see there's a pattern there, right? These are different family groupings.
I can see a pattern. Maniraptorans farther from birds such as Therizinosaurs are more dinosaur-like according to Joel. Oviraptorosaurs, which are closer to birds, are more bird-like, but still what Joel considers dinosaur-like to some degree. And then finally, the ones closest to birds, the Dromaeosaurs and Troodontids, are basically birds according to Joel. This is exactly the pattern of evolution, and Joel is just showing it on screen.
And now you might be looking at some of these, and you might see that the Dromaeosaurs and the Troodontids and the Oviraptors, some of them are kind of big.
No, that's not what I noticed. I noticed that Joel's own charts show the pattern expected by evolution, after you filter it through his absolutely insane version of how taxonomy works.
Bad Rexy. Get back. Move back. All right, stay still. Right there. Okay.
That's a suspiciously good T-Rex model. I can't seem to find it available for purchase. I'm legitimately impressed. And given that Joel is at least a minimally proficient Blender user according to his paper, it's possible he made this. If so, I must commend him. That's an excellent and quite accurate T-Rex. Although at some point the position of the hands were a little suspicious. I suppose that makes sense though, since as we saw with the Velociraptor skeleton he showed us in the first part of this, he doesn't mind dislocating bones if it suits him.
He's a big guy, Tyrannosaurus Rex. 43 feet long, very large, one of the largest predators to ever walk the earth, right?
Yep, although the length varied.
Allosaurus, also pretty big.
Okay, well, every nice thing I said about that Tyrannosaurus is not true for this Allosaurus. That looks like it came straight out of an AI image generator, especially with the weird peg-like teeth, the wrong number of fingers, everything about the arms being long and out of proportion, the weird shrink wrapping of the face, the iguana spines that just kind of melt into the neck, the weird tumors or whatever on the torso. This is disgusting.
32 feet long. So sometimes we think that dinosaurs are big and birds are small, right? You got a blue jay or a raven. That's a big chicken.
Is this just a long-winded way to say that some dinosaurs are small and some birds are big? Because, I mean, that's true, but why spend so much time on it?
Some chickens actually get that big.
Okay.
Ever been chased by a goose? That's not much fun.
Get on with it.
Ostrich, heaviest bird alive, 9 feet tall. It's a really big bird. This is a marabou stork. They're really impressive when they fly. We have a couple of these at the Ark Encounter Zoo. You should check them out. 8.5-foot wingspan. Not the biggest flying bird, though.
Okay, I'm cutting until he makes a point.
But you can't use size, as you can see, to tell the difference between birds and dinosaurs. We have to use other criteria.
I cut a bunch, and yeah, that was his whole point. Also, he used reconstructions of Sinosauropteryx, Microraptor, and Jianhuanlong that are misleading to the point of being outright lies.
Because there's big dinosaurs and small dinosaurs. There's big birds and there's smaller birds. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, what about some of the bigger dromaeosaurs, and some of the bigger oviraptorosaurs, like these guys?
No, I'm not wondering what about those guys. I'm wondering when Joel is actually going to give us a way to tell if birds are dinosaurs or not, rather than a way to tell if a dinosaur is a bird or not. Because he claims to want to do the former, yet all he's done is the latter.
Well, we're going to talk about them in a little bit.
Oh good, he's foreshadowing my future suffering.
All right, so now we're going to move on to the last 3 criteria. Some of you probably heard the phrase, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, then it's a duck, right?
Yup.
And part of the reason for that phrase is because birds walk very differently from dinosaurs and other bipeds.
Just like bats walk differently from mammals.
So, this is a photo of a roadrunner. And have you ever looked at a bird and wondered why its knee bends backwards?
No, because I know how anatomy works, and that those are ankles. The knee on that bird is covered by the wing, so you can't see it. Here's a featherless chicken, where the hind limb anatomy is not hidden by integumentary structures. It's pretty easy to see what's going on there. The thigh is mostly parallel to the spine, and the lower leg extends down with the ankle being about halfway down, followed by the tarsometatarsus, then the actual pedal phalanges.
Well, that's not actually its knee. That's actually the ankle. The knee is up in the body, usually covered by feathers, kind of hidden.
That knee isn't in the body, but yes, it's usually covered by feathers. But if it were in the body, you couldn't see it regardless of the feathers. It's like the bird's intestines. I don't care how many feathers you remove, until you get rid of the skin and muscle wall, you're not going to see the intestines, because they're on the inside. The knees are on the outside, although there is a patagium of skin stretching from the lateral side of the torso to the medial side of the thigh, just like there is in other dinosaurs, like Psittacosaurus, where that exact patagium was preserved in an exquisite skin impression, that also had melanosomes preserved in it, and even protofeathers. Funny how he doesn't seem to want to talk about that, isn't it? And yeah, if you can't tell, I'm getting pretty tired of giving Joel any charity.
And that's because birds are knee walkers.
That doesn't mean anything. Everything with a knee that bends at all walks with its knee. The knee joint provides part of the energy for the stride. How much varies.
Their femur, the first bone in their leg, stays relatively stable, and the rest of their leg moves underneath it.
Are you sure about that?
Here's a bird walking being x-rayed with a 3D overlay of one of its legs. I've certainly seen more femoral movement in a stride, but I've also seen a lot less. Also, since we're talking about femora, why not point out that one of the characteristics of dinosaurs is that they have a femoral head that is distinctly offset from the shaft and faces towards the body medially, such that it can interface with the laterally pointing acetabulum, or hip socket. And the dinosaur femur I've used to demonstrate this fact with is a bird femur. On the other hand, range of motion and neutral position of the femur is not and has never been part of the definition of a dinosaur.
That's why they look so funny when they walk. But dinosaurs, they walked more like people. They're hip walkers, right? The whole leg swings when they walk.
The whole leg swings when birds walk too, and this change in position isn't actually a change in the anatomy of the leg. Look, here's some birds with artificial weights on their back end. Notice when they have a simulated, long, heavy, bony tail, they swing their femora down, and more of the propulsion comes from the knee. That's because bipedal dinosaurs, including birds, all balance at the knee. In most non-avian dinosaurs, this means that their long tail is used as a counterbalance, allowing them to have fairly vertically oriented femora. Birds, by contrast, have short tails that are not very heavy when all is said and done, and also very, very heavy chests, given their flight muscles. So how can they balance at the knees without this counterbalance? Well, they bring the knee forward. Of course, the only way to change the position of the knee relative to the torso is by pivoting the femur at the hip. So the femur comes up, swinging the knee forward, and boom, now we have a stereotypical bird pose. But as you can see, birds can still adopt a more typical dinosaur pose if their weight distribution changes. So this is simply a change of posture, not an actual anatomical difference. It would be like saying that someone isn't a human because they don't sit up straight. This is absolutely meaningless to the question of if birds are dinosaurs or not.
So, what are some things that would help us discern if these feathered manoraptors walked like birds?
The presence of a pygostyle, the size of the fourth trochanter of the femur, wear patterns on the femoral head and the acetabulum, maybe footprints, although I'm not positive those would really help all that much on this particular question.
Well, one thing is the tail. We mentioned the tail earlier. So it seems like 30 tail vertebrae or fewer is about the threshold for a short tail. And
it's very clear that that number was just picked because that's the number that will let him artificially group together the Manoraptorans in one group to the exclusion of most other theropods. But hey, what if we scale up a Microraptor so that the first caudal vertebrae is the same size as in the Allosaurus? Oh man, would you look at that? The tail is actually longer in Microraptor than in Allosaurus. Okay, but maybe that's not fair. Let's size skeletal reconstructions of both Microraptor and Allosaurus by something other than caudal vertebrae. Let's do scaling to equal femur length. That's a pretty common technique in dinosaur science. Oh, would you look at that? They're basically the same length. It's almost like just counting caudal vertebrae is a dumb idea when it comes to determining if a tail is short or long. An Archaeopteryx actually has a tail that in length is far more like that of an Allosaurus than it is like that of a pigeon after you scale the animals. Based on tail length, there is every reason to think that when simply standing on the ground, Microraptor had its femur mostly perpendicular to the spine, or perhaps somewhere between the near horizontal posture of most birds and the near vertical posture of most non-avian dinosaurs. Before we move on, I want to point out that we generally don't actually have a good count of how many vertebrae are in the tails of most dinosaurs. Caudal vertebrae tend to be among the smallest vertebrae, and tails are some of the most easily damaged parts of an animal post-mortem. As a result, very few dinosaurs are ever found with completely intact tails, so even if this were a reasonable way to divide out short versus long-tailed dinosaurs, we can't reliably do it anyway.
As we look at these animals, you can see Microraptor has 26, Archaeopteryx only has 22, but if you look at some of these dinosaurs, they're up above 40 in most cases.
He said while giving only 2 examples. But whatever, this entire argument is like seeing who has a longer neck by counting cervical vertebrae and then concluding that because chickens have 14 cervical vertebrae, they have longer necks than giraffes, who only have 7.
And they've got these big, long tails because they need a center of balance that's at the hip.
Wrong. It's at the knee.
Because their leg needs to move from the hip.
No, it doesn't. If a non-avian dinosaur had a shortened tail, perhaps because of injury, it could, just like a modern bird, swing its femora a bit further forward. Granted, birds are better at this because that's their habitual and ancestral posture, but still, this is not even a difference.
And so they need a long tail to balance out their body. But birds, they have a center of balance further forward because they're walking from their knee, and their knee is further forward.
It's like he's trying to get the causation exactly backwards. Both balance at the knee. How far forward or back the knee is at rest and during strides is dependent on where the center of the balance of the body is. And dinosaurs, birds or not, will swing the femur to put the knees over the center of balance. And if you shift the location of that center of balance, either can adjust the knee to compensate.
So, question I'm sure you've all been wondering, can Archaeopteryx walk like a dinosaur?
Yes, because birds do walk like dinosaurs.
You can see that little tail that it's got. If Archaeopteryx tried to walk like a dinosaur, it wouldn't work. It's way off balance, right?
Wrong. That's only even remotely plausible if you pretend that dinosaurs always balanced at their hip, a structure that can't even move relative to the body as a whole, making it basically impossible for that to be how bipedal dinosaurs walked. In order to make something as dynamic as bipedality work from a balance perspective, the point of balance needs to be mobile, because the center of mass of the animal is going to change relative to the axial skeleton. That means that the point of balance for a biped can't simply be hooked to a part of the skeleton that can't significantly change position compared to the bulk of the axial skeleton. That's why the center of balance is at the knees, and the knees adjust position to account for different centers of mass. Even humans face this problem. When standing, the center of gravity of a human runs through basically the center of the pelvis. But when walking, it shifts dynamically as the torso tends to go forward and the arms tend to swing. As a result, the stride has to compensate for this, and one of the key joints for balancing is the knee. Try knocking with a knee brace preventing you from flexing your knee. You'll find it to be a pretty big problem. All Joel is pointing out is that dinosaurs with different centers of gravity and that balance at the knee must have different positions for the femur. This isn't exactly a groundbreaking discovery, nor is it a problem for evolution, nor does it make birds not dinosaurs.
And you'll sometimes see reconstructions of some of these feathered manoraptors that try to pose them like a dinosaur.
I've literally never seen one that didn't, because dinosaurs aren't defined by their pose. Nothing in biology really is. Like, humans don't suddenly become bears if they walk on all fours, and a bear doesn't become a human if it stands on its hind legs and walks a bit. Yet that's kind of the thing that, according to Joel, is not only of taxonomic significance, but of such significance that he can use it to break the other rules of taxonomy. That's completely off-the-wall insane. Joel is either a liar or he knows about as much about taxonomy as the average Rotten Tomato does.
And they make the tail look thicker than it actually was and things like that to try to make it look right, but it doesn't work.
I'm going to need a citation on that one, because there's no way in hell I'm going to take the word of a guy who thought that dislocating the fingers of Microraptor was a good way to demonstrate how you can make it look like a dinosaur. Look, Joel is a talented artist, but it's very clear from his willingness to make up structures we know animals did not have, like beaks, keels, and feathers, that he is not interested in looking at the data, and not contradicting it in his reconstructions. In fact, he will deliberately contradict the data in his reconstructions if that makes him feel better, as we have already seen with Microraptor, Archaeopteryx, and Sinosauropteryx. So when he accuses other people of his own fault, I won't say he's wrong, but I will also say that his accusation means nothing. It's like having Charles Manson accuse you of being a bad guy. I mean, maybe you are a bad guy, but I'm not going to give any weight to Manson's opinion. Similarly, I'm not going to give any weight to Joel's opinion about reconstructions he's not even showing us.
Now, some researchers are kind of thrown off by this because most modern birds have something called a pygostyle.
Yep, it's a fusing of the distalmost caudal vertebrae, and it is the attachment point for the tail fan in birds. Also, it's not most modern birds, it's birds, full stop. And yes, by this I am continuing to use the definition for birds that was requested by Answers in Genesis, members of the taxon Aves.
And it's a shorter tail with a set of fused bones on the end, and these extinct animals, these feathered maniraptors, they have something that's a little bit different from the pygostyle.
Yup, making them not birds, not as I define it, but as Gabriella Haynes, the Pet Answers in Genesis paleontologist, defines it.
But functionally, it's very similar. And you can see the base of the tail is very flexible, but the end of the tail is stiff.
It kind of serves the same purpose in that both are about balance and turning, but the Velociraptor configuration is for running, and the picostyle is about flight, in which there is an additional axis to worry about. Roll.
And that adds to their flight ability. It's kind of a flight control that they can use. And the same thing with Microraptor here. It's got an unfused pygostyle.
An unfused picostyle is like an unbrewed beer. It's just not a picostyle, and it's not a beer. If I invited you to my place for a beer, and then I threw some barley and hops at you and told you to drink up because it's unbrewed beer, you'd find that unacceptable. The whole point of beer is the brewing. No brewing, no beer. The whole point of a picostyle is the bone fusion. No fusion, and no picostyle.
But there's still stiffening elements in it. The end of the tail is still stiff, as opposed to the dinosaurs, like the Celosaurus.
Celosaurus? That's not a thing. Celosaurus is a thing, but that's a prosauropod, not anything that's on screen. But even the Allosaurus that is on screen and is labeled as all flexible, which sounds more like an escort ad than an anatomical description, is actually a tetanurine. That means it's a member of Tetanurae, a group whose name means stiff tails. Would you believe me if I told you that all tetanurines have stiff tails and the degree of stiffness varies, with Coelurosaurs having some of the stiffest tails, and among Coelurosaurs, the Maniraptorans having even stiffer tails? It's almost like there's an evolutionary lineage.
It's got that big, thick tail that's flexible all the way down.
And it is stiffened as you go distally, a trend that increases as you get closer phylogenetically to birds.
And this is really important because it's a problem for evolution. If a dinosaur, even if it evolved wings somehow, magically.
Ah yes, as opposed to being poofed into existence via a conjuration spell. The non-magical option.
And tried to fly or tried to soar, it wouldn't work.
Based on so-called flying lemurs, flying frogs, flying snakes, flying squirrels, and flying lizards, all of whom managed to glide with wildly varying anatomy, I doubt this.
It would fall out of the sky.
Joel is a decent artist. Why does he feel the need to show us this AI slop? This is horrible. The shoulders are on backwards, the legs have poorly defined joints, the toes are just abominations. Some of the wing feathers seem to end in claws. There are 2 nostrils on one side of the head. There are simply no fingers. As if I needed another reason to dislike Joel. Answers in Genesis really are a bag of dicks.
Because its center of balance is too far backward. The center of balance needs to be really far forward for flying to even work.
No, it doesn't. The center of mass needs to be forward enough compared to the center of lift that there is stability. The farther forward the center of lift is, the more stable, but less maneuverable the animal or plane will be. Now, I wonder if there's some way that you could have a long tail and also push the center of lift back so that the center of mass remains in front of the center of lift. Something like, oh, I don't know, a long tail that provides lift via a tail fan. Or maybe lift-producing feathers on the hind limb. Oh, right. So exactly what Microraptor has. Oops.
It would spiral out. It wouldn't even be able to glide.
No, that's what would happen if you stuck a long flexible tail with no tail fan onto a modern bird. But that's a straw man of the evolution of birds. Instead, they evolved from dinosaurs that already had stiffened tails and tail fans, meaning that they never faced this problem. Evolution doesn't propose that one day an Allosaurus was hatched with wings and that's how birds evolved. Remember, if you have to strawman your opponent in order to argue against them, it's a pretty good indication that they're right and you're wrong.
So, short tail. That's another major difference between dinosaurs and birds.
Wow, even on his own terms, that was a disaster. It's not even a difference. Many of the animals he's called birds had long tails, and notice how he didn't give any numbers? Yeah, that's because he doesn't have any. There's no magical tail length proportional to any other anatomical feature that makes an animal a bird.
So another thing is, again, that knee walking. And we'll illustrate that by looking at our Allosaurus, the skeleton here at the Creation Museum, Ebenezer.
I hate that one of the best Allosaurus skeletons in existence is held captive by pseudoscientists who are buddy-buddy with dominionist cultists. If there were ever a better argument for disallowing the private ownership of at least vertebrate fossils, I don't know one. Interestingly, in most countries, you can't actually own things like this privately. Also, because of the status of this fossil, nicknamed Ebenezer, which is a name I honestly like, it basically can't be studied. In order for a fossil to be studied in paleontology, it must be available for others to study so that the claims can be checked. Private fossils are generally not in this situation since access to them relies on private permission from the owner. The only typical exception to this is when privately owned fossils are temporarily made available at museums. But, real museums, not cultist flat earth adjacent propaganda outlets. The ethical thing to do would be to get careful casts made of Ebenezer and then to donate it to a real museum while keeping a replica on display. But no, the group that wants to outlaw you having a romantic partner they don't approve of and that wants to make it mostly illegal for women to vote gets to own one of the best preserved Allosaurus skeletons in the world. And all they do with it is spread lies. And if you don't think AIG would mostly outlaw women voting, then I'll just say this. Generally, you don't host speakers at a private venue that you find unacceptable. For instance, you're probably not going to find a skinhead convention meeting at a local Jewish center. AIG hosted a convention for Christian dominionists who would, by and large, outlaw women voting if they could.
If you look at that tail, number one, it's really long, like we talked about.
Which is meaningless in this discussion. What's not meaningless is hitting like on this video and subscribing. It actually means a lot to me and to the channel. It's the best way to grow this channel, so please like and subscribe.
But another unique thing about it that we see in dinosaur tails is it's got a lot of large muscle attachments. Look at all those bony processes that go all the way down the length of the tail.
Yep, the typical dinosaur tail has a lot of muscle attachments, but just like the difference in the tail muscle attachments between whales and other mammals don't make whales not mammals, I'm not sure how he's thinking he's going to make a point about this removing birds from dinosaurs.
That's because it's got, scientists think it had a large muscle called the caudofemoralis longus.
That's true.
It's a characteristic of archosaurs, not just dinosaurs, and birds still have it. That means that birds are archosaurs, which is a requirement if they're dinosaurs. Of course, nothing about the size or importance of the caudofemoralis longus muscle is diagnostic for dinosaurs. So he's just again going to give us a reason birds are unique among dinosaurs, but not one that they aren't dinosaurs.
And it needed to attach to that tail, and it used that muscle for walking.
Yup, in archosaurs, including dinosaurs, which includes birds, the caudofemoralis longus muscle is typically the main retractor for the femur.
Because that femur has to move somehow, right? And so there's a muscle attachment on the femur called the fourth trochanter. That big old muscle attaches to the femur, and it pulls the leg back and propels the animal forward.
Hey, did you know that having an asymmetrical fourth trochanter is actually a diagnostic criterion for being a dinosaur, and that birds meet that criterion? Well, now you do.
So there should be evidence of that muscle if it's a dinosaur. If it's a bird, we expect to not see evidence of that muscle.
Well, I've got bad news for Joel. His own paper says birds have a caudofemoralis, so seems like this is self-defeating.
Well, what do evolutionists say about this? Here's a quote from an evolutionist. In advanced forms such as oviraptorosaurs, troodonts, or dromaeosaurs, many of the modifications toward an avian style of walking had already taken place.
Yep, and Joel's response to things like this so far is to simply redefine birds so that these animals are birds, which doesn't actually mean anything. It's just word games. Let's see if he responds that way again.
So they're saying They're admitting that these animals, they already walked like birds.
First, there's nothing to admit. Second, that's not what was said. The quote was many of the modification towards an avian style of walking. Not all the modifications. So Joel is just lying. Also, his source for this is Limb Proportions and Avian Terrestrial Locomotion by Christensen et al., published in the Journal of Ornithology, July 1st, 2002. So this is a bunch of ornithologists who accept that birds are dinosaurs. This is contrary to the creationist claim that ornithologists do not agree that birds are dinosaurs, and that claim is something that comes from paleontologists in opposition to ornithologists. The paper starts with, quote, phylogenetic systematics unanimously concludes that birds, Archaeopteryx plus crowned clade aves, are a subgroup of theropod dinosaurs. The discovery of non-avian theropods from China with large pennaceous feathers offers additional support to this relationship, and implies further that feathers cannot be used to define birds as is traditionally advocated, end quote. Given Joel's previous propensity for just quoting the first sentence or two of papers, it's odd that he didn't do that here. Later, the paper says, quote, the long limbs of Caudipteryx are not surprising as limb length is related to phylogeny and body size. Primitive non-avian theropods have proportionally shorter limbs at any given size than more advanced forms, and small species have proportionally longer limbs than large species, as in extant mammals. Other theropods are known with proportionally very long limbs. The femoral morphology of Caudipteryx is identical to those of other non-avian theropods, strongly arguing against avian limb kinematics. Weird. So in fact, Maniraptorans, according to Joel's citation, actually don't walk exactly like birds. In fact, this study claims to have ruled that out. This is a Trojan source.
But they're not birds, they're dinosaurs.
Yes, because as his own source says, the limb proportions and kinematics are more in line with other theropods, and not in line with those of modern avians. Pro tip, if you want to argue for something, don't cite a source that says you're wrong.
Look at the language that they use there. Advanced forms, modifications that had already taken place. That's evolutionary language.
Yeah, imagine that. People using terms that refer to the only operating theory in biology that explains the origin of biodiversity. This is the same as a flat earther complaining that the word atmosphere is biased because it implies the globe. Yeah, it does. Because the globe is the position with all the evidence. Evolution is in the same position. If Joel doesn't like it, he can get the fuck over it and try to actually change the consensus, because until he does, scientists are going to keep doing science with the only theory about this that they have.
And this is all through the research papers. There's some things that are good observational science, and there's a lot of stuff that's just storytelling.
Nothing about that is a story. On the other hand, Genesis is literally a bunch of stories. Talk about special pleading.
So, here's a diagram of that. Again, that muscle that provides that locomotion in a dinosaur. Birds, very different. They have a muscle that has a similar name.
No, it's not just a similar name. It has a similar embryology, and it has the same muscle attachment points on both the tail and the femur. It's the same muscle. It's much smaller and is less important in birds than in other dinosaurs, but it's the same muscle.
But it does the exact opposite.
Not really. Let's think about muscles and what they do. Basically, they contract and relax. They can't push. If you pull your arm up like you're doing a curl, you're contracting your bicep. If you push with the same arm, you're contracting your triceps. When a muscle contracts, it tries to lower the distance between the attachment points. So what's the difference between moving the femur back and the tail down? Well, nothing from the standpoint of the muscle. What happens to the organism depends on what structure is better braced. In most birds, it's the femur, which is braced by pretty much the whole mass of the organism. In most other dinosaurs, it's the tail, which is heavy, dense, and strongly connected to the rest of the axial skeleton and the hips. To show you why these actions are the same thing, let's consider a human example. The previously mentioned biceps. Usually we would say that the thing that biceps does is move your lower arm. But let's say you're in 0G, like on the International Space Station. If you're holding onto some handle and you flex your bicep, your lower arm will stay put and the rest of your body will move. Does that mean that the function of your bicep has changed? Well, in some ways, yes, because now it's controlling the location of your whole body rather than just your lower arm. But in another way, no, it still does the function of bringing the attachment points of the muscle closer together. That's what it always did. This is what is happening here. The caudofemoralis, whether longus or not, brings the posterior side of the femur closer to the ventral side of the tail. Period. As birds became more and more ankle dominant in walking as a result of their very far forward center of mass, the femur became the more stable point in the skeleton, which means that the same muscle went from mostly moving the femur to mostly moving the tail. This isn't some kind of rocket science or mystery or contradiction in evolution. The whole point of evolution is explaining how organisms change. Pointing out that something changed in a lineage isn't an argument against evolution.
It anchors to the stable femur that's not moving, and it has the ability to help move the tail.
Right, which isn't the opposite as long as you remember what muscles actually are.
So what do we find in these feathered manoraptors? Well, there's Microraptor. We don't find the big muscle attachment on the femur. We don't find big muscle attachments all down the tail. It just had most likely a small muscle there that provided some tail movement. So they walked like birds.
Which is an odd conclusion since that's not what his source says. But hey, I don't really care since it doesn't really matter either way.
And this is really important for flight as well, because it allows that tail to move separately from the legs. A dinosaur can't do that.
Actually, it doesn't. If both the tail and the femur are unsupported and unbalanced, as in flight, contracting the caudofemoralis muscle will move both the femur and the tail. It's physically impossible for it not to.
A dinosaur's tail has to stay stable while it's walking or running to give it the power, something to anchor to.
No, dinosaur tails swayed when they were walking specifically because the caudofemoralis longus was the main femoral retractor. Since the tail isn't rigid at the base, it is again physically impossible for that muscle to contract on one side but not the other, and not sway the tail towards the side of the body on which the femur is going back. This isn't some special evolutionary assumption. This is the basics of, how a lever works. Like, does Joel know what a fulcrum is? A lever arm? If you know what those things are, then you can figure this out. Joel apparently can't.
All right. So we are at 6 major differences between dinosaurs and birds. Short tail, knee walking.
And we're 0 for 6 on reasons birds aren't dinosaurs, and 6 for 6 on reasons why birds are unique among dinosaurs. Let's see if the final one can finally actually be a reason why birds aren't dinosaurs.
Last one, hip structure.
Interesting, because the hips are one of the places where birds are most obviously dinosaurs.
So birds have, you can see the blue bone there, they have a pubic bone that points backwards toward the rear of the animal.
That's true.
Dinosaurs have, in that green bone there, a pubic bone that points forward.
Wrong, 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 wrong.
That's the typical arrangement for saurischian dinosaurs, but ornithischian dinosaurs are so named because their typical arrangement for the pubis is to point towards the back of the animal. And further, as we go through Coelurosauria, even in Tyrannosauroidea, the pubis is pointing much more down than forward. And in the Manoraptors, that Joel is calling birds, the pubis is more vertical than posterior, as you can see in Anzu, an oviraptorosaurid from North America. An animal that Joel thinks is just a bird. But then even in the more bird-like Deinonychosaurs, we start seeing a pubic bone that points a bit backwards, as in Microraptor or Velociraptor. And yet, unlike in modern birds, which lack a pubic symphysis, that is, the place where the pubic bones join in the middle, those animals do still have a pubic symphysis, differentiating them from birds. It's almost like a perfect transitional sequence.
And if we look at these feathered Manoraptors, we expect to find pubic bones that point backwards. Now this one's a little bit hard to tell. In some reconstructions, there's room for interpretation as far as what the exact angle was.
It's fun how, if you just arrange those in order of how close they are to birds in the consensus, they make for a great transitional sequence.
And so some of these there's debates about, what was the exact angle, and how far was it pointing backwards, or was it vertical? But overall, it's pretty consistent.
Is it? Because I'm seeing Coelophysis as the most basal animal on here with the most anteriorly projecting pubis, with Allosaurus and Stachyosaurus having slightly more vertically oriented pubis, then the consognathids, Sinosauropteryx and Huaxiangnathus, having more vertical ones, then Caudipteryx and Khan having very vertical ones, and then getting more posterior with Microraptor, a dromaeosaur, and then slightly more posterior projecting in the almost birds Gehalornis and Cathiornis, and then basically actual crown birds having the most posterior pointing pubes. I'm not sure how much more convincing of an evolutionary sequence we could possibly have, especially since the rest of the anatomy of those animals is more and more bird-like as we go, not just the hips.
The pubic bones in the dinosaurs point forward, the pubic bones in the feathered Manoraptors, the birds, are vertical or pointing backwards.
Right, as predicted in evolution. How does he not see this?
Doesn't anyone notice this? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
And this is a big problem for evolution, too. An evolutionist says, additional support for a locomotor transition within Eumenioraptora comes from the evolution of highly retroverted pubes, that's rear-facing pubic bones, which, as previously studied, have proposed is likely to have fundamentally altered the moment arms and by inference functions of several major locomotor muscles.
Weird, because that sentence endorses this transition. It doesn't propose a problem. I wonder how Joel will twist this. Also, that same paper, linking the evolution of body shape and locomotor biomechanics in birdline archosaurs by Allen et al., published in Nature 2013, also says, quote, rather than a discrete transition from more upright postures in basal-most birds, Aviale, and their intermediate outgroup, Deinonychosauria, our results support the hypothesis of a gradual stepwise acquisition of more crouch limb postures across much of theropod evolution, although we find evidence of an accelerated change within the clade Maniraptora, birds and their closest relatives, such as Deinonychosaurs, end quote.
What are they saying? Basically, the whole pelvis was re-engineered between dinosaurs and birds.
No, the pelvis includes the ilium, ischium, and the pubis on both sides of the body. If the whole pelvis was changed, then they talk about the other two hip bones. But also, I'm not sure what the argument is. Is he pointing out that a paper about the evolution of birds talks about change? Well, yeah, birds evolved within Dinosauria. They would have to have changed, since basal dinosaurs aren't birds. That's rather the point of evolution?
They're completely different structures.
Nope, it's the same bones with the same muscles. They even share the strong connection between numerous sacral vertebrae and the perforate acetabulum, which are diagnostic of Dinosauria. Indeed, the avian synsacrum is preceded by numerous synsacra in multiple lineages of dinosaurs.
Which makes sense if God created these as different kinds of animals, right?
Maybe. I don't know. The problem with a theory involving an omnipotent entity is that almost anything can be said to make sense. So, that God could do a certain thing a certain way if he were real doesn't really do anything to provide evidence that he actually did anything at all.
Alright, so we've got our 7 major differences between dinosaurs and birds.
Okay, I guess we're not going to get into the synsacrum or the open acetabulum with Joel. Fun how the only parts of the hip that are actually diagnostic for membership in Dinosauria are the parts of the hips that Joel skips over. Well, I'm not going to skip over them. Let's start with the simpler bit, the acetabulum. As regular viewers of my channel will know, the acetabulum is the hip socket. It's called the acetabulum because the shape of a human hip socket is kind of like a small cup that Romans used to put vinegar in, so that they could use it as a condiment when eating. In most tetrapods, humans included, the socket is a cup of bone, hence the name, which has a coating of cartilage that interfaces with cartilage on the femoral head, preventing bone-on-bone contact. Dinosaurs do things a bit differently. Instead of a cup of bone formed from the fusion of the 3 hip bones, dinosaurs have a ring of bone that is open on both sides. If you had a dinosaur hip in front of you, you could throw a dart right through one acetabulum, through the other one on the opposite side, and not hit bone. This condition is called open or extensively perforate, and it's the condition of bird acetabula too. To understand the synsacrum, we need to look at the anatomy of a vertebra. Vertebrae consist of several parts. The most obvious one is the centrum. That's the disc of the vertebra. And except in cases like the first cervical vertebrae, the last caudal vertebra, or in cases of bone fusion between vertebrae, it interfaces with the previous and next vertebra in the spine. Next comes the neural arch. This is above the centrum and it's the hole through which the spinal column passes. If someone has nerve damage as a result of a spine injury, it often involves damage to this part of the vertebrae. Above this is the neural process, which often anchors various muscles. To either side of the neural arch are the transverse processes, which also often form muscle attachments. In a synsacrum, the sacral vertebrae fuse to each other and the transverse processes fuse to the iliac crests. This is actually very common in dinosaurs, and it is universal in birds. In fact, having 3 or more sacral vertebrae with a strong attachment to the sacrum is a diagnostic criterion for dinosaurs. And birds have it. The hip of a bird is alone enough to show that birds are dinosaurs.
There's more. We've got a whole list of other things that we're going to be looking into and researching.
Brain case and inner ear. Not sure what they're going to claim about that. I'm not aware of any distinctive aspects of dinosaur brains or ears that are diagnostic, but then I'm not omniscient. Bird eggs and nesting. Well, many dinosaurs did that in a very bird-like way, so I'm not sure how that will help the case that birds aren't dinosaurs. Perching and curved claws. I mean, claw curvature isn't diagnostic for dinosaurs or birds, although it is very helpful in determining lifestyle of the animal in question. So while this is interesting, I fail to see how it could help take birds out of Dinosauria. Bird breathing. Well, that's common to tetanurans at least, and possibly all of Ornithodira, given the extensive skeletal pneumaticity of pterosaurs that is very much like that of birds. So this seems like it will further unite birds to dinosaurs. Last is bird digestion. I'm not confident we have sufficient fossil evidence for this to help or not. Well, I look forward to all the nonsense, cherry-picking, and outright lies that these so-called studies will produce.
Because there are tons of differences between dinosaurs and birds, but these are the ones we've had time to research so far.
Then he should have presented those, because the 7 he did present failed entirely to show that birds aren't dinosaurs.
So jumping back to this, you can see there's a consistent trend of blue bird traits in Aviale, Dromaeosaurs, Troodontids, Oviraptors, and even Alvarezsaurids, which are funny little birds. They remind me of kiwis.
There is a clear trend. A trend of increasingly bird-like animals as you get closer to Aviale, the widest group that usually gets called birds. Also, I don't know why Coelurosauria is listed as a group here, since literally everything in this list is a Coelurosaur. I don't even know what it means that they're shown as a separate category here. Also, I noticed that he said that Maniraptora are birds, but Therizinosaurs, who are Maniraptorans, are listed as being almost entirely dinosaur-like.
That's weird. That's suspicious.
And then the dinosaur family groups, Coelurosaurs, the Tyrannosaurs, the Compsognathids, Ornithomimids, and actually Therizinosaurs.
Who, by the way, do have feathers, even though he said they don't, do have a semilunate carpal, even though he said they don't. So, even within Maniraptora, and even with his word games, we have an obvious non-bird that even he can't deny. Instead, he just pretends it's not a real Maniraptoran by pretending it didn't have a semilunate carpal.
Which, some people call them like the panda bears of the dinosaurs. They're just weird.
They are weird, not sure if that makes them pandas, but whatever. One group of people who are definitely not pandas are my patrons and channel members. If you're enjoying this video, why not check out my Patreon linked above and in the description, or the channel memberships with the join button below this video. You get early access to videos like this, as well as to my super secret Discord server, which is only for supporters. And there are more perks at higher tiers.
You should look them up. I don't have time to go into them right now. They're actually in Maniraptora, but they look like dinosaurs.
Which means that his whole argument that Maniraptora is all birds kind of just fell apart. And if they're in Maniraptora but aren't birds, that makes birds a subset of Maniraptora. And if Therizinosaurs are dinosaurs, which his chart said they are, then that means that Maniraptora is a group of dinosaurs, which makes birds a group of dinosaurs. It's hard to overstate the degree to which him saying that Therizinosaurs are Maniraptoran dinosaurs destroys his entire point. This is the kind of thing a small child can understand.
So they're one of the exceptions.
I'm sorry, no, that's not how this works. If you think that some Maniraptorans are dinosaurs, then either all dinosaurs are Maniraptorans, or some dinosaurs are Maniraptorans and some aren't, but all Maniraptorans are dinosaurs. There are no other options.
And you notice there are a few exceptions here in the data. There's some greens where you'd expect to be blues, and there's some blues where you'd expect to be greens.
Kind of like what you'd see if birds evolved from dinosaurs.
And our researchers have done a ton of work looking into every single one of those exceptions in that data set.
I look forward to reading the results in the Answers Research blog.
And it seems like either there's a good reason for it, like, oh, it's a flightless bird, so it doesn't have quite as much of that reinforced shoulder.
Which, if that's the argument he's going with, he can't then really use that shoulder condition as one of his criteria for being a bird. But either way, he hasn't actually shown that having a bird-like shoulder girdle is a reason birds aren't dinosaurs. So now it fails on both ends. It always failed to show that birds aren't dinosaurs, but now apparently he can't even show that an animal is a bird in the first place, at least not reliably.
Or there's just biased interpretation or bad data.
Yes, the data that show him to be wrong are biased. How convenient and science-like. Ignoring contrary evidence or dismissing it is definitely not a sign of pseudoscience.
All right, so our hypothesis. God only created feathers on birds. What do you guys think?
Well, first, your hypothesis contains an unsupported assumption, that God created any organisms in particular at all. And second, since Joel has already defined anything without branching feathers as not feathers, and those animals with feathers as birds, we can't even assess the hypothesis. He's contrived this to only have one possible answer if we accept his terms and his God hypothesis. I do neither.
Seems like it was correct. From all the evidence we have so far. So could God have created birds on dinosaurs? Yeah, he could have.
Making the God hypothesis untestable and not scientific, even if it's true.
Did he? We don't have any evidence of it yet.
Which is the same amount of evidence that they found that he created birds with feathers.
So probably not.
I agree. God probably didn't create any non-birds with feathers.
All right. Now the big question I'm sure everybody is curious about. What about the raptors?
I'll be honest, that wasn't one of my questions, but he's already said that Microraptor was a bird, and that's a dromaeosaur, so I would think that his conclusion would be that raptors are birds. They're actually about as close to Aviale as you can get, and Aviale is the group that are usually called birds, even though I wish they weren't.
Let's talk about raptors. I really enjoy these movies, the Jurassic movies. They're really fun. Like Brian said, I've been a dinosaur lover since I was a kid, so I've seen them all in theaters, and I really enjoy them. The raptors from the Jurassic movies were actually based on two animals called Deinonychus and Utahraptor.
Incorrect. Velociraptor was based on Deinonychus and was the size of Utahraptor, but that was just a coincidence. Utahraptor was described in January of 1993 by James Kirkland. Pre-production for Jurassic Park began in August of 1990, with production starting in August of 1992. That means that in the 34 or so months of pre-production, production, post-production, and the lead up to release, Utahraptor was only known about for the last 6 months. Indeed, post-production started in November of 1992 and only lasted until May of 1993. That means that in order to base the Velociraptor from Jurassic Park on Utahraptor, the change in design would have to have taken place entirely during post-production from January to May 1993. This would mean that they would have had to go back and reshoot any scenes with the raptor costumes that had been produced during pre-production, as well as changing any rendered assets at a time when a single CGI frame could take about a day to produce. It is impossible that the Jurassic Park raptors were based on Utahraptor.
So I'm going to talk about them briefly. And the movies promote a common misconception, and that is that we find dinosaurs like this.
Articulated dinosaurs are found. Look at Black Beauty, or the Fighting Dinosaurs. But it's very unusual.
All together, articulated, beautifully fossilized. That doesn't happen very often.
Fair play to Joel. He did say that it's uncommon, and I thought he was going to say that it doesn't happen. He is correct about this.
So let's talk about Utahraptor. The yellow bones are what they found for Utahraptor in the beginning.
Okay.
That's it. Now, they've supposedly found some additional ones since then, but they haven't published anything about them, really. We don't have good descriptions for them.
It's true that the results aren't currently published, but they definitely found more bones. That's not in dispute that I'm aware of. But it also doesn't really matter much to the question about Jurassic Park raptors. I'm honestly not sure what the point of talking about Utahraptor is at all.
And they were found in just this big heap of bones of a bunch of different species, and it's hard to tell, well, what was Utahraptor and what wasn't, so that's probably why they haven't published much on it. Here's the drawings of the bones from the actual original paper. But that doesn't stop them from creating a reconstruction in a museum like this.
Yep, that's the Utahraptor reconstruction at the Brigham Young University Museum of Paleontology. In fact, this is an official photo from BYU taken by Jaron Wilkie, and it's featured as the first picture on the Wikipedia page for Utahraptor.
So how do they do that? Well,
after determining that it is a dromaeosaur in the first place, by doing things like looking at the hypertrophied pes digit 2 ungule, characteristic of dromaeosaurs, and then using its proportions to scale up a generalized dromaeosaur skeleton. That's all this is. It's a scaled up generic dromaeosaur, or raptor. That's the best you can do with such fragmentary remains.
They look at the animals that were more primitive than it, supposedly, and the animals that were more advanced than it, supposedly, that they do have better fossil evidence for, and they create a reconstruction based on their story.
Nope, they can just look at other raptors. Like, imagine if you found bits of a cat skull from one otherwise unknown cat species. We know that cats have distinctive ears that are diagnostic for Felidae, just like raptors have distinctive claws. And we'll say that this cat skull preserves at least one of the ears, so you know it's a cat. How would you reconstruct this unknown cat? Well, you'd reconstruct it as a generic cat of a size appropriate to the skull bits you found. Is that an accurate reconstruction? Well, it'll be mostly accurate, since it's not like cat skeletons vary wildly. But it won't be completely accurate, since they're all unique in some way, and your reconstruction doesn't represent that. So what, though?
Deinonychus, that's Utahraptor. We don't even have enough bones to know what Utahraptor was at this point.
Yes, we do. We have teeth and the killer claw from Utahraptor. Dromaeosaurs have distinctive claws and teeth. If we have those, we can say it's a dromaeosaur.
The yellow bones are what they found for Utahraptor in the beginning. That's it. Now, they've supposedly found some additional ones since then, but they haven't published anything about them, really. We don't have good descriptions for them. And they were found in just this big heap of bones of a bunch of different species, and it's hard to tell, well, what was Utahraptor and what wasn't, so that's probably why they haven't published much on it, whether it was a bird or a dinosaur, right?
No, we can definitely say that it was a dinosaur and not a bird.
So, if you love the idea that the raptors in Jurassic Park were real, and you want to say, oh, Utahraptor looked like that, go for it.
Looked like what? Naked raptors? I mean, they definitely didn't. We already know that they had feathers based on things like Microraptor and the quill knobs known for Velociraptor. The fragmentary nature of Utahraptor does nothing to change that, especially since the Jurassic Park raptors weren't based on it in the first place.
That's all I have to say about that.
So nothing useful to the discussion. That's what I've come to expect.
Deinonychus. Dr. Haynes has done a ton of research on Deinonychus.
Ah yes, the woman who couldn't understand Linnaeus and didn't know what a picostyle is. Telling me she's done research on a dinosaur and that you're going to base what you're about to say about it on her work doesn't exactly instill confidence in the coming statements.
And she's talked about how these specimens were found 50 million years apart, 30 miles apart, 30 years between expeditions. There's all these different, and that's true of even just the skull bones that they've found. They didn't find an articulated skull.
As is typical, many dinosaur species are known from multiple partial skeletons.
They found a bone here, a bone there, a bone here, a bone there, none of them all together, and they put this skull together and said, I think it looks like this.
Yeah, and they did it with the benefit of decades of expertise in comparative anatomy and dinosaur anatomy specifically.
Same thing with the rest of the body.
Notice how most of the bones are known from both specimens, meaning that we know it's a single species. Meaning we can absolutely combine the specimens to get a good picture of the entire skeletal anatomy of Deinonychus.
So this brings up a really important point, and that's these words articulated versus associated. So, anybody here like to do puzzles?
I'm not a huge fan of jigsaw puzzles, but I do like many kinds of puzzles, and really, I do like jigsaw puzzles just fine. I'm just not a real big fan. I'm like a small fan.
I like puzzles. My family likes puzzles. And so, you get a brand new puzzle from the store. You open the box, and you rip the bag open, and you're digging through the pieces. You know those pieces that come from the factory already together? Those are articulated. All right, they're already together. You know that they belong together because they're connected.
Yep, sometimes the die doesn't cut all the way through the card.
Right? So those are articulated. Those are the best fossils to find because we know these bones, two bones went together. The rest of the pieces, they're just associated. They're in the same box, right?
Right, but we know they go together because they fit together. Much like what happens in vertebrate paleontology all the time. Scientists actually check the fit of associated bones to see if they can fit together. And sure, we don't always have all the bones to check, but just like if you took a couple hundred pieces out of a 1,000-piece puzzle, you could still tell that the puzzle went together, and even what the picture is, that still works in paleontology, even when some of the bones are missing.
Now, imagine you're doing 10 different puzzles all at the same time in the same living room. Some of you puzzle makers just had a panic attack.
Okay, I'm imagining it. Also, why the hell are we seeing another AI-generated image? Joel couldn't just dump some puzzles on his floor and table? He had to use AI to generate a shitty image with incomprehensible pillows, outsized puzzle pieces, books with not actual writing on their spines, and whatever the hell that abomination is on the table? Elect me as 48th President of the United States, and I'll make the use of generative AI punishable by death. Actually, don't do that. I won't accept the job. I don't want to be president.
No, I can't do it. Some piece is going to get lost, right?
Yeah, probably, and guess what? That won't really matter much to figuring out what the picture is on any of the puzzles.
So that's what paleontology is like, right? You've got all these different animals fossilized all around the world, and you're trying to associate these bones together to figure out which ones went with which animal.
And like with jigsaw puzzles, you can check by seeing if they fit. And you have the added advantage of having other people who want you to be wrong checking. And if they can't show you you're wrong, then guess what? You have a strong reason to think that you're right.
And if you leave the puzzles out long enough, your kids are traipsing through the living room, pieces are going to get mixed up. This puzzle's pieces are going to be near the other's puzzle pieces. But in general, they should be kind of close to the same area where you started it. That's kind of like the evolutionary assumption of how fossils are.
Oh, I suppose that is in opposition to the flood model. I wonder what the flood model predicts.
The animal died there, its bones are kind of scattered around the same area. That's their assumption because that's their worldview.
Right, so what's the alternative?
Now imagine a giant flood comes through your living room. You got waves crashing everywhere, water swirling around, and then the water all goes away. Would you have any idea which piece went with which puzzle?
Yes, by checking for the fit. Also, I guess now we know why he wanted to do AI, because he didn't want to flood his own room. I guess that's fair, but it's also clearly not the same room, just another one generated with the same prompt. AI sucks so much. I'm sorry for subjecting you to it.
No, you'd have no idea.
Wrong.
That's the creationist worldview with paleontology.
Okay, well, since creationists don't really do paleontology, I don't care.
When we find a bone, and it's mixed with some other bones, do we know it's the same animal?
Does Joel? No, I doubt it. Do scientists? Well, at least sometimes, yes. Not always because you can't always find the bones it connects to, but even then you can check to see if it's consistent with other animals in the same taxon. For example, if you found a tibia, a femur, and a dentary bone, and a rib all identical to those of bison, and all from an animal that would have been the same size, it's reasonable to conclude that you found the fragmentary remains of a single bison individual.
No. Not unless it was articulated and they were connected and you could tell it was the same animal.
Still wrong.
And so it's really hard.
That's what she said.
And that's why when we find something like this, it puzzles evolutionists and creationists who are like, oh, that's exactly what we'd expect from a worldwide flood.
There's nothing puzzling about this. These bones are from the Dinosaur National Monument. They are numerous vertebrae, ribs, and long bones, some of which look like sauropod bones. It's part of the Jurassic Morrison Formation, almost none of which physically even can be flood rock, with some of it even being aeolian, that is, wind deposited.
It's a whole jumble of bones, right? This is Dinosaur National Monument.
Yeah, bones get jumbled. Things happen like decay and scavenging before preservation.
So, and that's another reason paleontologists are so excited when they find something like this. It's a fully articulated animal, all fossilized together. And so, as we've done our research, we've based these criteria and this research on articulated animals first. We wanted to figure out, okay, if it's right with, if the data we're looking at is correct on the articulated animals, which it most likely is, then when we look at the disarticulated animals, we'll have a better chance of being right.
Convenient way to throw out data, I guess.
Pop quiz. I know Brian said there wouldn't be any more pop quizzes today, but I've got one for you. All right. I want you to take the 7 criteria we talked about.
Okay, the 7 things that did nothing to even attempt to show that an animal isn't a dinosaur. Got it.
All right, feathers, swivel wrist, the shoulder, the short tail, the knee walking, the hip structure, and we're going to evaluate an animal. And I want you guys to tell me whether you think it was a dinosaur or a bird. Okay? All right, here we go. Let's look at the wrist. Does this look like a dinosaur wrist?
Yes, in a bird wrist, the carpals and metacarpals would be fused into a carpometacarpus, meaning that while this is a dinosaur wrist, as are all bird wrists, this is not a bird wrist.
That bends and grasps, or does it look like a swivel wrist that swivels sideways? What do you think? Swivel wrist. Good. Shoulder. Is that an angled shoulder, or is that just that continuous scapulocoracoid?
There is an angle, like in many dinosaur coracoids. This is just a dinosaur shoulder. In fact, the strap-like scapula is a characteristic trait of tetanurans, which means that specifically, this is one of the stiff-tailed theropods.
It's the angled shoulder, right. Let's look at the hips. So Microraptor and Archaeopteryx, those are their hips. Our animal that we're looking at.
Well, they all have open acetabula, so all of these are obviously dinosaur hips.
Looks like bird hip.
Actually, none of them look like bird hips, where the pubis flares out and runs parallel more or less to the ischium. But hey, who cares about being right when you've got propaganda to push, right, creationists?
Let's look at the tail. Here's an actual photo. Around 26 tail vertebrae. Big muscle attachments? No. Looks very much like a bird.
Except the birds have digostyles, and this doesn't. And this is in fact the tail of Velociraptor from the famous fighting dinosaur fossil. So once again, we're looking at a non-avian dinosaur, at least according to the Linnaean definition of bird, which I want to remind everyone is the definition that AIG has pushed in their own literature.
This animal that we're talking about, we haven't found feathers on it.
But we have found ulnar quill knobs, which is like saying that we haven't found preserved eyeballs, but we have found a preserved eye hole in the skull. So we know pretty well that it had both eyes and feathers.
But there's an animal in the same family, around the same size, that we did find feathers on. It's very similar. And you can see giant wing feathers, big tail feathers. So, that animal is called Genuine Long. It's a pretty big animal, about the size of a big turkey. And our animal is there at the bottom. All right, what do you think?
Well, given that it has all the synapomorphies of a dinosaur, and not all those of a bird, I'm going to say that it is a non-bird dinosaur, in that it is not a member of Aves. But of course, Joel has simply redefined bird to mean Maniraptoran, except when he says so. I'm going to guess he'll conclude that this is a bird based on his inconsistent word games.
Raise your hand if you think our animal was a dinosaur.
Well, that should be everyone.
Raise your hand if you think our animal was a bird.
Thanks to Joel for reminding me that if you lie to a credulous audience, you can get them to believe the lies. Not that here in 2025 we actually need such a demonstration. We've had plenty of them in the last decade or so.
That animal is Velociraptor.
Yeah, it's not hard to figure out since he used one of the most famous Velociraptor specimens in the entire world.
I didn't call Velociraptor a bird, you just did.
No, I didn't, because I can see through his lies, because I actually bothered to learn a thing or two about the subjects like what a dinosaur is, what a bird is, and most importantly, the most basic babytown shit about set theory.
Don't tell anybody that I called Velociraptor a bird.
I mean, this is going up to my thousands of subscribers, so I guess I am telling people that.
Here is a beautifully articulated fossil specimen of Velociraptor fighting a dinosaur, the Protoceratops. So we know it's not the associated problem. It's not just a bag of bones that were found together. So I don't know what to say. I'm sorry if I crushed some of if I killed your favorite dinosaur.
Nope, Velociraptor has never been my favorite dinosaur, and Joel can't kill it, because they've all been dead since before he was born, and he didn't do anything to even hint that it's not a dinosaur, except just not understand how taxonomy works.
Velociraptor may have been a bird. That's all I can say. We haven't found feathers on it yet. Maybe we will someday. We'll see.
Nope, because by the classical Linnaean definition that Gabriella Haynes loves so much, it's not a dinosaur because it had the wrong shaped tail, body, and it had teeth. Plus, it lacks virtually all of the synapomorphies that define aves, and nothing about Joel playing word games changes that.
All right, so if we look at all of the feathered manoraptors, the ones we actually find with real feathers, branching structures, there's only about 15 or so of them.
I'm noticing some very not posterior-oriented pubis in that bunch, just saying.
There's over 100 species in Manoraptor and in those families, but only 15 or so have actually been found with feathers.
I mean, only if you use his intentionally dishonest definition for feathers, but okay.
And one of the things that confuses us is how these animals are presented. Because if you look at them like that, they kind of look like dinosaurs, right?
Yeah, but only because they have the actual anatomy of dinosaurs, something no amount of posing will change.
But if you strip away all the assumptions and just look at the bones and repose those bones based on the things that we talked about, with wings that can fold and legs that had that knee that was closer to the center of balance, and then you put the feathers back on,
they still look like dinosaurs. And I noticed that he's also just adding beaks where we know they didn't have one. So just doubling down on the lies. And I know it's a lie because he himself in his paper cited a source on how to tell if animals have beaks, and the animals in this picture mostly don't fit those criteria, except for a few, like Archaeopteryx, which actually did have a beak. Once again, I guess lying is okay if you're lying for Jesus.
They look a lot like birds, don't they?
Yeah, most of them are paravians, the group of animals that's really close to being birds. So we'd expect them to look like birds, and they'd still look a lot like birds without the fake beaks that he's added for no reason except propagandistic reasons.
The evolutionary worldview affects the interpretations and the images that represent these animals too. So when you see an image of an extinct animal, don't just take it at face value. You need to dig a little deeper sometimes and ask some questions about it.
Just don't pretend that word games and lies are going to be enough to counter the consensus. But hey, that's it. After that, it's just wrap-up stuff from Joel, and I don't have anything to say about that. I'd say that this whole thing was a disappointment. But honestly, this is what I've come to expect from creationists on this subject. All we got was wordplay and lies without even the barest attempt to show what a dinosaur is. Which should be the first step to saying that something isn't one. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. And if you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthoven, Thurevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Elron Teller, Ian Chen, Calvin Brostick von Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, Edwin M., North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.